Good evening, everyone. You're in the right place at the right time. This is Coast to Coast AM, blasting out of the Mojave Desert like a Scirocco, blazing across the land, into your town, into your home, slamming into your radio like a supercharged nanoparticle of unobtainium. Greetings from the boldest, bawdiest, most outrageous city in the world, the planetary capital of sun, fun, sin, sex, and secrets, my not-so-humble hometown, Las Vegas, Nevada. My name is George Knapp, your occasional host, designated driver of the airwaves, and moderator of tonight's upcoming cacophony of conversation, filling in tonight, but glad to be back with you once again. And for those of you wondering, the answer is no. I was not out with Paris Hilton on Friday night here in Las Vegas. What happened to Miss Hilton in Vegas most decidedly did not stay in Vegas. She was busted for drug possession, joining a long list of celebrities who've ended up in the clink here. I don't want to talk about Paris Hilton, but I know that a lot of folks from around the country have called me, seeing what I know about it. Admittedly, as a celebrity, you really have to screw up to get yourself arrested in Las Vegas. But from the stories I've read, she really did. Wanted to say thanks to the many Coast listeners who sent me the article from the LA Times about these two mummified babies that were wrapped in newspaper, found in an old apartment, been there for decades, maybe 70 years. And this news story noted a connection to a doctor named George Knapp. And no, that's not my dad or my granddad. Most certainly isn't me. Maybe there's a family connection somewhere far back down the line, but if there is one, it's not one I know about. Odd story, though. Thanks for sending it to me. We got a few odd stories of our own to tell you about, compiled on the Coast to Coast website. Before I get into those, a brief overview of what we have in store for you tonight. Prepare to have your brain frazzled, rearranged, discombobulated. You know, we've all pondered our own mortality, wondered what happens when we die. Do we really go to heaven or hell? Or is it all just a bunch of nothingness, just the end? You know, different religions have different takes on those questions. Science has its own view, but there is another way to look at it. Dr. Robert Lanza, a prolific writer, medical doctor, and scientific researcher, was on the program with Art Bell earlier this year to talk about his book called Biocentrism, which incorporates quantum theory into a new view of the world, the universe around us, a much different perspective on reality itself. And it was a wonderful interview by Art, but it covered only part of what Dr. Lanza's ultimate message means for all of us. So tonight, we have him back for a couple of hours to talk about life, death, time, and space. If you think the present always follows the past and comes just before the future, if you think that time is linear, goes in one direction, that space has dimensions that are set, well, wait till you hear this stuff. It is a mind blower. In the second half of the program, we take a departure from cosmic mysteries and tackle something that's also exotic, but a little bit more down to earth, the search for Bigfoot. Last year, when I had ex-cop David Paulides on the program to talk about his rock-solid forensic investigation of the Bigfoot mystery, I promised to have him back, and that happens tonight. And he'll be bringing along a distinguished colleague, Dr. Melba Ketchum, to talk about DNA testing of suspected Bigfoot hair samples, and I got a feeling this could be a classic discussion. Webmaster Lex and I have compiled another assortment of odds and ends from the news, and we do emphasize the odd. Here's one for you. What cosmic irony it would be if Adolf Hitler turned out to have Jewish ancestors. Well, these DNA researchers say they've come up with some really surprising findings in their investigation of Hitler's family tree. You can read about it on the Coast to Coast website. Also, where would you go if it hit the fan, the big one? The end is near. The asteroid is on its way. The bombs are falling. We found an article about the best places to survive the apocalypse. You can probably guess a couple of these, but I think others are going to surprise you. 60 years ago this year, some of the very best UFO photos ever snapped were captured by the Trent family in McMinnville, Oregon. The pictures have been tested, they've been analyzed, they've withstood the test of time, and even the debunkers have had trouble explaining them away. A friend of this program, Bryce Zabel, ponders what the cover of Time magazine should look like if journalists, mainstream journalists, treated the UFO topic with an open mind. So I want you to check out the artwork and then read the essay that accompanies it. We've got the link for you. Powerful ray guns, are they the stuff of Buck Rogers and sci-fi, or are they here? Not only are they here, they're already being used in some prisons to keep inmates under control. And as you might expect, such weaponry is causing a bit of a stir with civil libertarians. I imagine these prisoners are not too happy about it either. You can check out that article as well. And I have an update on the wild horse situation, which I always like to mention when I can, as I am hosting the program. The roundups I've been telling you about for a couple of months continue at a breakneck pace, and that's probably literal as well as figurative. Another one is starting up here in Nevada, where BLM is going to zero out another vast area of public land. And by zero out, I mean every single wild horse must go. Of course, cattle and sheep will remain on this land, even though the land, the specific range, was designated in the law as being set aside for wild horses. The real news about these horses is in Washington, though. 54 members of Congress have called for a moratorium on roundups and an independent study by the National Academy of Sciences of this troubled, broken government program. And this weekend, we learned that BLM says it's now going to cooperate with this study. It's all for it. It could take 2 years for this thing to be completed, though. Not sure how many horses are going to be left out there on the range by the time 2 years is up, because BLM says it will not agree to any moratorium on the roundups. The roundups will continue, which means Mustangs will continue to die, and those that don't die will be shipped off to these fenced camps where you, the taxpayers, will fork over the money to feed them for the rest of their lives, rather than allow them to live and die like wild animals that they are, out on the public range, which is what is prescribed in the law. Anyway, a couple of updates on that situation, if you care to check them out, are on the Coast to Coast website. Time now for our first break, then prepare to be blown away. Dr. Robert Lanza joins us to talk about a whole new way to look at everything. I'm George Knapp, and this is Coast to Coast AM. Thank you for tuning in tonight on Coast to Coast AM. My name is George Knapp, filling in tonight. About 5 or 6 years ago, I was working on a book project, doing some research on the subject of alternate realities, parallel worlds, things like that. And I picked up a brilliant work, something written by a guy named Dr. David Deutsch of Oxford. And it's a book called The Fabric of Reality. It's all about the multiverse theory, the idea that there are alternative realities, alternative dimensions, that there may be millions or an untold number of versions of me living different lives with different outcomes. Somewhere I'm married to Pam Anderson and I'm president of the United States. Things like that. The same is true for all of you. And it really changed the way I looked at everything. It really made me think about reality itself and my place in it. And this week, I've been reading a book that's sort of having a similar effect on me, making me think about the world in a much different way. And in some ways, it's kind of a logical extension of that earlier book by Dr. Deutsch, but this one, called Biocentrism, goes much further in looking at questions that are central to all of our lives. Is death the end? What happens after that? Is it possible that the past is not set in stone, that time is not linear? Big questions, ambitious answers. Dr. Robert Lanza, the author of Biocentrism, joins me now. And Dr. Lanza, great to have you on the show.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
I wonder if for those who did not hear your earlier interview with Art, and I know this is asking for a lot, but could we start by giving the audience sort of a recap, a thumbnail sketch of biocentrism that we can use as a sort of a basic outline and a launching point for the rest of the interview?
Well, biocentrism is a new theory of everything. It's an out-and-out challenge to our view of the world. And we think that life is an accident of physics, but there's a long list of experiments that suggest just the opposite. So amazingly, if you add life to the equation, you can explain some of the biggest puzzles of science. So, for instance, it becomes clear why space and time, or indeed matter itself, depend on the observer. So biocentrism basically says that life and consciousness are the keys to understanding everything.
It's, I guess, the theory in a nutshell. It's like the old riddle about the tree falling in the forest. If there's no one around to hear it, does it make a sound? And you'd say probably not. I mean, that the tree falling in the forest is something that's done for our benefit, or it directly involving us being there.
Exactly. Well, I think that, reality is definitely a process that involves our consciousness, and we have, at this point, literally dozens and dozens of experiments that very clearly show that the behavior of particles, of real particles of matter, depend on the observer. And, one of them is this most famous two-hole experiment, and it turns out that when a scientist actually watches the particle go through a barrier, it can actually go through, when you watch it, it goes through one hole or the other, just like a little ball, just like it should. But amazingly, if you don't watch it, it acts like a wave and can actually go through both holes at the same time. So again, how can a particle out there change its behavior depending on whether or not you watch it? And then the answer, again, is simple, is that reality does indeed involve our consciousness.
And is it all our own realities? Do we each have our own? Are we all the star in our own movie?
Well, I think obviously, we all have interacted during our lives. We know there's an intersubjective interaction. So, yes, there's cause and effect. There are laws of physics, and all that equally applies. I think what we have wrong is, as Einstein did point out, that space and time are indeed relative to the observer. So we carry space and time around very much like a turtle carries a shell around.
How do you, I was reading your resume, and it's a really impressive resume. You're a medical doctor. You do a lot of work on things like stem cell research. Mm-hmm. How do you end up on this path? I mean, studying quantum theory, quantum mechanics, quantum physics.
Well, the entire premise of biocentrism, that's where the bio part comes from, is that basically everything is related to the biological organism. So again, it's the observer who actually determines the behaviors of the particles, and it is actually the observer who determines pretty much everything.
Help me understand this part of about the past. Let's start with that one. Time being, you're saying you don't think it's necessarily linear, that there's the past, and that comes before the present, and the present comes before the future. It doesn't have to go in that direction.
Yeah, that sounds a bit crazy at first glance, but I think more and more scientists, including Stephen Hawking, now says that, he has a top-down cosmology, and it actually makes quite a bit of sense if you think about it. If you imagine all the days that have passed from the beginning of time, and you stack them like chairs and put yourself at the top, we don't just accidentally happen to be on the cutting edge of all times. It's not just a big accident, a one in a gazillion chance. So you can actually think of a very real experiment, and there are many of these. There was an experiment published in the prestigious journal Science 2 or 3 years ago, and scientists in France actually shot particles of light, known as photons, into this apparatus. And what they actually showed is that they could retroactively change something that had already happened in the past. So what happened is these particles had to pass a fork in the apparatus, and they had to decide what to do, whether to behave like a particle or a wave when they hit this beam splitter. But then later on, long after the photons had actually passed that fork, an experimenter could then flip a switch on or off. And it turns out that what the experimenter actually did at that point, now in the present, actually determined what the particle did in the fork in the past. So at that moment, that experimenter chose his history. And, of course, we live in that same world. There are other experiments. There was one done back in 2002 where they actually, again, used particles of photons, and it turned out that their distant twins actually knew in advance what would happen in the future. So they were testing the communications of these particles, and they let one photon hit its barrier first. And then it had to decide later on, what the other twin would do. And what they found is that what the other photon was about to do, that the one that had already finished his journey actually knew in advance what was going to happen. It's just amazing. These are real experiments.
Well, I guess, the obvious question for people hearing this is, does that mean we could change our own past? If we had the technology, quantum computers, unlimited budget and energy, could we change our own past, or could we change, say, we can stop Oswald from killing JFK?
Well, I don't think, we can go back and change the past, but I think it's very clear that we will in the future determine the past as, and there's a number of reasons. So let me explain this. When you think of particles of matter, they have a range of possible states, and it turns out, according to quantum physics, that it's not until they're actually observed that they take on real defined properties. So until the present is determined, how can you have a past? In fact, one of Einstein's last colleagues, his name was John Wheeler, he actually coined the word black hole. He actually said, quote unquote, that the quantum principle shows that there is a sense in which an observer, what he will do in the future, defines what happens in the past. And just before he died, he actually made a statement saying that when you observe light from a quasar way off in the universe, we are actually setting up a quantum observation on an enormous scale. And it means, he said, that measurements that are made on the light now actually determine the path it took billions of years ago. So more and more physicists are realizing that that is the implication of many of these experiments.
I remember reading something about Einstein writing about, I think the word he used was spooky, where he was talking about the connection between particles and far distant. Can you explain what he meant by that? And is that sort of where you're heading with this?
Well, yes, and actually Einstein himself, just before he died, one of his good friends known as Bessel actually had died, and Einstein famously had said that now that Bessel has departed from this strange world a little ahead of me, that means nothing. He says, people like us know that the distinction between the past, the present, and the future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. And so, again, yes, the spooky action at a distance is something known as quantum entanglement, and it turns out that particles actually can be instantaneously connected even on opposite sides of the galaxy, and they behave as if there's no space or time between them. And again, there was actually an experiment that was carried out last year in Nature where they actually took these vibrating ions and actually put them at a distance apart. And it turned out that whatever happened to one of them actually instantaneously affected the other one, as though there was no time or no space between them. So they were instantaneously connected, apparently in violation of even Einstein's theory of relativity.
That quote from Einstein, people like us know that the distinction between the past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. I had circled that because I wanted to ask you about it.
Oh, yes, okay.
It's in your book. Did anyone ask Einstein to elaborate on that? Did he ever write anything else to explain what he meant?
Actually, I don't believe he did. Obviously he, put forth his, theory of special relativity and a number of years later his theory of general relativity. And actually Einstein never really said what space or time was. He simply said that space is what we measure with a measuring rod and time is what we measure with a clock. And he didn't really go into what they were, because again, what are space and time? If you wave your hand through the air and you take everything away, what's left? And, the answer, of course, is nothing. And the same thing applies for time. So, we have some very difficult things here, and I don't think Einstein ever really attempted to say what they were.
Talking about the experiments that you said where the scientists could show that the past was not written in stone, that it could be different, it could be a different past. Mm-hmm. Does that sort of a concept bring up the same kind of conundrums that come up when you talk about time travel?
Actually, no, they don't. And again, this goes back to what when you started the show, you had mentioned about the many world view, the multiverse. And one well-known aspect of quantum physics again is that observations can't be predicted absolutely. So instead, there's a range of possible observations, each with a different probability. So this is a mainstream explanation called many worlds interpretation, and what it says is that these possible observations correspond to a different universe, and so together they collectively form what's known as the multiverse. So there's, in theory, an infinite number of universes, and everything that could possibly happen occurs in some universe. So, of course, in that case, death doesn't exist in any real sense in those scenarios because, all possible universes exist simultaneously, regardless regardless of what happens in any of them. So what is going on here is that space and time, as I mentioned earlier, are relative to the observer. Again, so that is why you now appear to be on top of all of infinity. You know, if you stacked all the days on top of one another, it's just silly to think that you could actually just by chance be here. So again, you will always be in the now. The past is simply the logic of the spatial temporal logic of what you are actually experiencing in the present.
Well, tell me this: where are you personally on this multiverse idea? You sort of were non-committal, and I got a feeling you had general support for it. But
I would agree with many of the physicists who would say that anything that's physically possible has to occur. I would definitely say that it's completely consistent with the experiments and what I know of it. I think that one of the things, of course, science has to do is actually explain the real world that we actually, are living in some logical way. So I think it's consistent, but I think there needs to be more. I think we need to actually make sense of the world we're in terms that we can understand. So, I think it's correct. It makes perfect sense, and I'm certainly on board with it.
And so that means that somewhere in some reality, Hitler won. The Nazis conquered the world. In some reality, there really is a whole room full of monkeys with typewriters who've written the great American novel. All things are possible.
Yeah, I think exactly that's it. I think that, as you move ahead in your life, there are, obviously many possible futures. And when you collapse your quote-unquote probability waves, at that point you pull the past, into existence. And so I think that just because you're here now in the present doesn't mean that each individual who ever lived in the past didn't have all the same possibilities.
All right, we'll come back to that. Dr. Robert Lanza, fascinating discussion about his book, Biocentrism. Led Zepp taking us into the break. Stay with us on Coast to Coast AM. I guess our guest, Robert Lanza, would say that time to the zombies or anyone else is relative. It's not set in stone. It's kind of flexible. Ditto for space. And the implications of that for humanity are staggering and mind-boggling. And specifically, how does this theory of biocentrism relate to our concept of death? Robert Lanza says we may be completely wrong about our ideas about what happens after our physical bodies die. We'll get into that right after this on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast. I'm George Knapp. My guest is Dr. Robert Lanza, who has written this book, Biocentrism, How Life and Consciousness Are the Keys to Understanding the True Nature of the Universe. I want to sort of elaborate on this, Robert, about the nature of reality. Are you saying that we, in effect, create our own reality? I mean, you're essentially saying that consciousness is an essential part of the reality around each of us, right?
Yes. So space and time are not these invisible objects that just exist out there. They're actually tools of our mind. And, of course, everything you can experience and perceive is ordered through your senses in terms of space and time. So in that regard, space and time are unique to the animal observer. And, of course, once you recognize that, you realize that everything else has to, revolve around that. That doesn't mean that there aren't certain laws of causality or that we don't follow certain algorithms as to what's happening. So if I say, I'm going to jump off a roof and I'm going to fly, I have news for you, you're going to get hurt very badly. And the same thing goes, for when you open your cabinet in the morning to have breakfast, you can pick between Captain Crunch and cornflakes, but you really, at that point, still everything that you are experiencing is related to the observer. So it's much like a dream if you think about it. When you're in a dream, you're actually able to move and navigate in space and time, and you actually have a fully functioning body. But of course, your mind is also creating, you can probably feel and touch things, and there's probably trees around you and clouds up in the sky. So your mind is actually very, very good at putting together everything you're experiencing. So you think right now, for instance, that, as you're sitting in your chair and looking out, that I just see that. Well, that's silly because, of course, you can't see through the bone that surrounds your skull. So everything you see right now is being reconstructed in your head because you can't see that. So what you're actually feeling, touching, and experiencing at this very instance is a construction in your mind because, quite simply, you cannot, like I said, see through that bone. And that's a very hard thing for people to realize. And the same
Tell me
thing, about
it.
Yeah, well, let me just give you an example. So if you consider the weather outside, you see a blue sky, but I could change the cells in your brain so that it looks green or red. Or with a little genetic engineering, I could probably make everything that's red vibrate or make a noise, and the logic goes on and on. So again, everything that we think is just the way it is, think of a person who's colorblind. I mean, things are black and white. There aren't colors. And people will say, for instance, for the tree, well, we know, well, if there's no one there, of course, you won't hear the sound. But the truth of the matter is, we know from our experiments that there's not a single particle out there that has any defined properties until it's actually observed. So even those air molecules, if you were to put them in these apparatus, they would exist only as a state of what we call superposition. There are uncertainties. So there's actually a certain probability that those particles will do certain things. And it's actually not until they're observed, until the mind lays out the scaffolding, that they actually take on very real properties. And this comes back to, for instance, Heisenberg's famous uncertainty principle. So if there was really a world out there with particles just bouncing around, then we should be able to measure all their properties. But you can't. So, for instance, you can only know if you can't know a particle's exact location and momentum at the same time. And so why should it matter to a particle what you decide to measure? And so, again, the answer is simple. The particles, aren't just out there. And so, again, it's the same as with the two-hole experiment or with these entangled particles. Why should it matter what an observer does in terms of watching one of the particles? Why would that change the behavior of the other particle instantaneously? Again, these observer-determined properties of matter have been shown over and over, literally hundreds of times.
Just to sort of quantify it or use an example, I mean, I wake up in the morning, I look across the room, there's a chair, there's a stack of papers, there's a couple of books.
Yeah.
Is that stuff there? Does it exist if I'm not here to observe it? If I died and I didn't wake up in the morning.
Yeah, so this is very confusing. You get up in the morning and you shuffle off to the kitchen and your dirty clothes are in the same place and your socks are right in the drawer where they're supposed to be. And think about it very much like a CD or a calculator. You can take a brand new calculator out of its package, and if you multiply 4 times 4, you'll always get 16, or you add 2 plus 2, you'll always get 4. And so it's an information system. And this is, again, think of your brain. It consists of literally hundreds of trillions and trillions of neurons all interconnected, and it's a computer. And again, you can just take a disk with information on it, and you put it in your CD player, and here you go. You've got, a three-dimensional movie that you're watching, and with sound and all. So again, information needs to be converted into something that makes sense, and that's where consciousness comes in. So again, space and time are indeed the tools that we use in our mind to put it all together. But then when you start to think of, well, what is space? You look over the horizon and you can see forever, and if you take everything away, what is it? It makes no sense. And the same for time. Well, what is this thing? You can't put it in a bottle like milk. So these are funny things. And the reason they're funny and they're not tangible is because they're not things. They're not like, the shells you pick up along the beach. They're actually forms of perception, the way we assemble things. So when you get up in the morning and your clothes are there, yes, anything you observe is very real. I mean, it's exactly what you perceive. Again, Des Scott's famous statement, I think, therefore I am. So again, that's real. But again, what the experiments are showing, and this is actually consistent with, many of the Eastern religions, again, is that obviously these things exist in consciousness. And so you think of yourself only as your body, but even your body, just like, the clothes in the morning when you get out of bed, are all made up of this shimmering haze of particles. And each of those particles have a certain wave of probability of existing, and when you observe them, they take on real forms, just like in these experiments. Now, the critics will immediately say, no, that's nonsense. That this behavior is limited just to the atomic world, into the microscopic world. But this two-world view, that is that there's one set of physical laws for small objects and another one for the rest of the universe, including you and I, it has no basis in reasons. And in fact, it's being challenged in laboratories around the world. Again, last year I mentioned to you there was a paper in Nature that showed that even these large charged atoms were actually able to exhibit this, as Einstein said, spooky action at a distance. There were other experiments carried out with these huge molecules known as buckyballs, which have like 60 carbon atoms, but they're symmetrical. They actually exhibit the same behavior as do these particles in the microscopic world. And then even back in 2005, there were crystals that actually showed these entanglement ridges that were half an inch high. Quantum behavior in the ordinary world of human-scale objects. And there are new experiments being designed that'll probably show it works at the same level as you and I and cats. So this is something we can no longer just continue, to ignore. We have this outdated scientific paradigm that contradicts itself. It just doesn't work, and it's almost of no value when it comes to explaining these experiments.
Well, let me put it this way, in sort of a personal, completely non-empirical way, is that you mentioned in one of your essays about, even when you were a boy, you realized there was sort of something unexplainable about life that you didn't understand. And I can remember thinking about reality just as a kid, and I'll bet a lot of our listeners had the same thought, is that some days seemed more real than others, that sometimes reality was kind of thin, and it seemed like a dream or a movie or not really my life. Is that related at all to what you're talking about?
Absolutely. I think we all gutturally know this. What has happened is through life, through being bombarded with books and our scientific view of the world, we no longer question these things. So we're sort of brainwashed to some extent as we get older and older. And, this is exactly what Einstein himself ran into. This is where he came up with his famous line that God doesn't play dice. But in fact, in the great debates with Niels Bohr, it was very clear that, he lost because people tend to have, they grow up. There's like you can't teach an old dog new tricks. So we're very, very much instilled in language that have each word has meaning. Again, we go to movies, we read the books. Everything is reinforcing a certain view of the world, and it's only now through science, through the experiments, that that whole thing is just dissolving. And the problem, unfortunately, is to accept the experiments on face value. It's pretty tough. To tell somebody, that things aren't the way they've always been taught that they were, it's pretty tough. To tell someone, for instance, that who killed JFK may not be determined until something that happens in the future, they just think you're nuts.
Well, I was wondering about that. Well, you're an MD. You do straightforward kind of research into life and death kinds of issues. I wonder what the reaction has been among your medical colleagues and then among your scientific colleagues in general.
Well, you have to remember, again, that this is an out-and-out challenge to physics and indeed the whole view of the world. So it's not surprising that some people get defensive. But that being said, I've gotten literally dozens of emails from people, from professors and even chairmen of scientific departments at Johns Hopkins, Columbia, biologists, chemists who say, you're right on. But it's very much a paradigm shift, so that if you try to think your way through this, and you can trip very easily. So by definition, a new paradigm always appears to be nonsense from within the established paradigm. So it's very hard for people to say, what about this? What about that? And you're going to always come into this with prejudices and preconceptions. And so it's very, very hard for a person who's gone through their whole life with a view of life and death and what it's all about to suddenly just throw that all out the door and saying, well, we live and die in a world of illusions. And unfortunately, or fortunately, whichever way you want to look at this, science is more and more leading us down a way where we now need to have a worldview that's consistent with all of the experiments. And this isn't something new. Again, for instance, Eastern religions have argued for millennia that birth and death are equally illusory, that consciousness transcends the body, and that external is really a distinction of language alone. And when you have that, you're really left with nothing but the consciousness is the bedrock of existence. So yes, I think we all have doubts about, certain days and other days, and, why am I here? Why is the universe here? What was here before the universe? If there's a God, who created God? And we all have these questions, and we run into all of these conflicts in contradictions because, of course, the way we look at the world now just simply isn't rational.
One of the paradigms, or at least the central questions that comes up when people consider things like the multiverse and other dimensions and realities and life and death is this particular universe we live in. And you touch on it in the book about why this particular universe sort of seems designed to allow life to go on. It has everything that we need, at least in this reality, to live and prosper and thrive. And we get perilously close, I guess, to religious implications, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But what would be your answer to that? It sure sounds like creative design or
intelligent design.
Yeah,
absolutely, yeah. And then, of course, this, raises all sorts of concerns. As a scientist, I'm a bit concerned, of course, separation of church and state. And obviously, many religious people have hijacked a certain aspect of the universe. And it turns out there's a truth absolutely to what they're pointing to. So, for instance, it turns out that the structure of the universe is probably the best argument for biocentrism. So it has a long list of traits that make it appear as if everything was tailor-made just for us. So, for instance, the Big Bang, if it was one part in a million more powerful, the cosmos would have blown out too fast for stars and worlds to form. Or, for instance, if the gravitational force was just a hair less, stars wouldn't ignite, there wouldn't be a sun. The result? No us. So, again, there are over 200 parameters and laws like this that are so exact that it strains reason to think that they're just purely dumb luck, random. You tweak any one of them and you never existed. And none of these are predicted by any theory, and they all seem to be very carefully chosen to allow for life. And so that doesn't make any sense within the existing scientific view of the world. So, so people say, God did it. But obviously in a purely scientific view, God isn't really appropriate there. But according to biocentrism, it makes perfect sense. And again, when you think of Stephen Hawking's top-down cosmology, of course it makes sense. And that is because, until you collapse the present, there isn't the past. And the past is simply the logic of what's going on. So say right now, I'm talking to you on the phone, but I'm sitting on a chair. The chair, if I follow the logic, is on the Earth, which is rotating, which is going around the sun, which is circulating in the Milky Way. And if I extrapolate that logic all the way back, eventually, in terms of time, I'll go back to this event we call the Big Bang. Or if I extrapolate it in space, I will come to the edge of the known universe. So again, when we think of the universe, it's very much like one of those globes you used to have in geography class in high school. You can spin it around. And you go, this is the whole Earth. But just because you have the globe there, on your desk, doesn't mean you can go to Antarctica or the Taj Mahal. So again, that's what the universe is. It's just the logic of what you are experiencing. So again, even when you think of touching something and it's solid, this is solid as a rock, we know scientifically that it consists of particles spinning around at trillions of times a second, and that it's almost entirely empty space. And then when you get down to the energy itself, Einstein himself even said, when he was asked if he believes in God, he said, well, there must be something behind the energy. So I think we intuitively know, that there are some issues here.
Well, the idea of biocentrism does not necessarily exclude the idea of God. And I raise the question, I don't want this to be an existence of God discussion, but it's not, right? I mean, the two are not necessarily mutually exclusive.
Yeah, no, I don't take a position on that. I think that, from my perspective from biocentrism, I think that there's no question that there are components of religion that have truth, and there are components of science that have truth, and I think there are some of those components that actually may be contradicted by some of the facts. But I don't take a position. I don't think we are in a position to say there is or there isn't a God. What I can say is that clearly, there's much more to nature than science acknowledges. I think there, lots of elements of religion that are correct, that science has wrong. I think there is indeed absolute justice in the most meaningful sense of the word. Personally, I don't believe in a wrathful God who drowns people, like in Noah's flood. But I do indeed think that, for instance, even Emerson said, he once famously had a quote that said, the influences of the senses in most men have overpowered the mind to the degree that the walls of space and time have come to look solid, real, and insurmountable. And he said, to speak of these in liberty is the sign of insanity, and it really is. I mean, we just think that we die and rot into the ground, but it's just a silly idea, in fact.
Well, I want to spend a lot of time on that, but before we leave the general religion area, is there it's part science, it's part philosophy. What you're espousing here, does it become a religion? Could it become a religion?
Well, you speak of philosophy, and I know scientists are, very defensive about this, but the truth of the matter is science, by definition, is natural philosophy. And so it is a philosophy. And I think that, as a scientist myself, I think, we do a fantastic job at this or that detail. So, for instance, we know exactly how long it takes right to the second for Mars to go around the sun. Where we do really, really bad are the big questions, which unfortunately encompass everything, what it's all about, what's going on. And I think science has a ghastly job there. And religion has filled in that gap. It just comes in and, says this is the way it is, and some other religion comes in and says, no, it's this way. And then, then you just take somebody's word. But I think what we need now is, we've been around for a few thousand years now with scientific methods. We need a new paradigm that works, that is actually internally consistent, that actually makes sense of all of the experiments. And I think when we have that, we're going to start understanding more of how the world goes together. Now, call that religion, call it science, but I think that there are elements here of the bigger picture that we can get our hands around.
All right, and we'll jump into the main one. The main topic of tonight's discussion is what happens when we die. Are we really dead? Right after this, we're talking with Robert Lanza, Dr. Robert Lanza, author of Biocentrism. Stay with us on Coast to Coast. We got our own heavy topics here. Reality isn't what it seems. Observation and consciousness are necessary elements of what we call reality. Time is not necessarily linear. The past is not necessarily set in stone. And that leads us to the big question, death. Is it illusory? Is it real? Does life go on? We're going to get into that right after this on Coast to Coast AM. Dr. Lanza, you do not believe in death and the general understanding the way the rest of us understand it. Make the case.
Well, we believe in death because we've been told we die. And so we associate ourselves with the body, and we know our bodies die, end of story. But biocentrism tells us that death isn't really the terminal event we think. So although our bodies are destined to self-destruct, the alive feeling, the me feeling, is just a 20-watt fountain of energy operating in the brain. But this energy doesn't just go away at death. So one of the surest principles of science is that energy never dies. It can't be created nor destroyed. So going back to the multiverse, life is like a flowering, an adventure that transcends our ordinary linear way of thinking. So when we die, we don't do so in this random billiard ball matrix of, like space and time being an object, but rather in this inescapable life matrix. So life has a nonlinear dimensionality. It's sort of like a perennial flower that will bloom in the multiverse. And so again, it's very much like some of these experiments that I was describing, like the science experiment. You can say, okay, well, or you have these multiverses, but does that energy really transcend from one world to the other? And so regardless of the choice you make, it will always be you who experiences the outcome, the universe that will result, just like in the science experiment. So again, the linkages between the histories and universes transcend our ordinary ideas of space and time. So again, I think there are multiple ways of looking at that. Another one is simply, when we think that if the world is indeed as physicists believe, observer created, then we shouldn't be surprised it's destroyed with each of us. Nor should we be surprised that space and time vanish and all our conceptions of order. So at death, consciousness is gone, but also to the connection of times and places. So where do we find ourselves? We find ourselves very much like Einstein said, that space and time are relative to the observer. Without consciousness, space and time are nothing. So in reality, when you die, it's essentially, without the glue of consciousness, time is essentially reboots. So you could, at that point, take past or future as your new frame of reference. And so time, or I should say death, is a reboot that leads to all the potentialities. And that's, again, the reality that the experiments mandate.
Go ahead.
Another way to actually look at it, when Einstein was referring to the past, present, and future being an illusion, you could think of reality being like a recording. So depending on where the needle is placed, you hear a certain song. That's the present. And the music before and after is the past and future. So likewise, every moment always endures, but you have to experience each song separately, piece by piece.
Well, let's break this down a little bit.
Okay.
We finished the show at 2 o'clock this morning. I go to bed. I have a heart attack. I die. My physical body dies. What happens next?
So
I reboot, meaning what?
What it means is again, each of us, space and time are the relationships of the observer. So when you die, at that point, essentially you can take any point of view you want. So in terms of the multiverse, what we could say is that the past and present, future, they're really illusions. They're only connected in a linear way as long as you have consciousness. So if you were to die, the best way to probably think about this is that all the possibilities that you had, with or without the heart attack, will exist simultaneously. Again, you will always experience all of those possibilities now in the present, but they're not connected like little blocks on a string. That's where our thinking is very one-dimensional. You got to remember, this is the real problem in a nutshell, is that we were evolved in the forest roof to collect fruit and berries, and that's not a skill set that helps us understand the nature of the universe. And this is why these experiments, are causing so much chaos. Is that we just like to see everything black and white. You die, you rot into the ground, and then you turn to some of these religions, be it the Eastern religions or whatever, and they say no, life and death is illusory. So we gutturally know there's something wrong with this static view of the world that science is presenting, so we turn to religion. But I think what's happening now for the first time is that science is now starting to catch up with its experiments that are challenging, some of these sterile ways of looking at things.
So is the same thing true for dogs, bugs,
yes,
amoeba?
I think what's going on here is any creature that has a sense of space and time, obviously if a creature locomotes and it moves, it means that it has a perception of space and time, which means it has the algorithms that are necessary, to obviously experience consciousness. And so, yes, any creature, a higher vertebrate that has the ability to discern and operate in space and time, and we can obviously project from that they obviously have a sense of space and time and therefore operate by the same mechanism. They're the same biological creature.
I guess what I'm going to ask you next would require some guesswork on your part, because I can't imagine how anyone would know. You had mentioned about the 20-watt bulb that's in my head, or that the energy that basically is me. We know that science says the energy continues. I guess what we don't know is that it continues as me after the physical body is gone. Do you have an idea on that?
Well, again, if we go back to like our science experiment, we know, for instance, when that experimenter decides whether to flick the switch on or off, he actually determines the past. He determines the history of that event and what universe he is in. But it doesn't really matter whether he turns it on or off. He is going to be basically the person that experienced the outcome. So again, you can think of it as basically like the 20 watts of energy as hollow projecting either this or that result on the screen. So again, whether the experimenter turn the beam splitter on or off, it's the same battery, it's the same agent that's responsible for the projection. So you will experience it, but again, your memories or whatever are going to reflect who you specifically think you are at that moment. But it doesn't mean that the who am I, that feeling is any different. It will be you sensing it's you in all of those scenarios.
And I wonder, do I know that I'm dead and that I've rebooted?
No, you don't. Just like you don't know that you're rebooted now as you're talking to me. So no, that's exactly it. The best you're going to come now to knowing it is understanding it here in one of the universes. So again, right now, you're trying to make sense of it, but you won't obviously have direct memory of what's in your brain in the future. You may have very similar experiences, and if you got killed going off the road in black ice, you may not. You may continue on and live your life, but you're not going to know that that there are all these other possibilities.
So it is sort of consistent with some Eastern religions and the karma, reincarnation. You're making the choice about where to reboot and what time and what stage you're at.
Yeah, I think another way is to think of when you people you think of projecting your love and your hope to whoever you want, and in a way you truly do transcend the universe in that sense. So for instance, if you reboot, you really are in a privileged position to really say, okay, you can pick your daughter or your son as your new point of reference. So you die, and you can always know that your child is going to go on the way you know. But on the other hand, you also have the ability to know that at the same time that if you die, you're not really dead, that you're no more dead than you were before you died, if that makes any sense at all. In other words, that if we talk about, again, the multiverse to make this conceptually easy, it's that all of these possibilities exist simultaneously, and it's only a flaw in our way of thinking that we think space and time have to be connected, again, like little pearls on a string. Again, they're connected in a nonlinear dimensional way. So again, this is where the multiverse theory came up with to begin with, is that we know that literally every particle has a whole range of possible states, and that when you observe it, you collapse one particular outcome. But we do know, depending on how it's observed or not observed, that you will have a different outcome. But all of those things exist, and that is where the multiverse comes from. That they're saying that, of course, they all exist, but they're obviously not things you're going to experience at the same time, because it just defies the nature of reality.
In your book, Biocentrism, you mentioned that the question of death hit you on a personal level when your sister died, and that you went out and talked to the rest of the members of the family. When you came out and talked to the members of your family about the departure of your sister, did you make this presentation? Did you say, "Don't worry, she's not dead"?
Well, obviously this is a very highly intellectual thing to understand,
Sure.
and so you're not in a position to do that. But what I can say is that yes, that just like in these experiments where Schrodinger's cat experiment, the cat is both alive and dead. And I did make the effort, and I think it is comforting to let them know that, I like to consider myself a rational person, that it's perfectly intelligent to be thinking that, okay, when you die, that's not the end of it, that in fact, that everything, again, I think of it as the record, that, like Einstein also said, past, present, and future are illusions. They all exist simultaneously, and it's just where the needle is. But where you move the needle doesn't mean that the rest of the record goes away. And so, yes, I think it's a very comforting feeling for people to know, particularly if they're not religious, that it's just not all black and white like we were taught in the school books. You don't just rot into the ground and end of story. That's just so silly, and it's just basically not even consistent now more and more with all the experiments.
It's sort of the history of science. I remember reading at one time, the history of science, the advance of science has been sort of a lesson in humility for mankind, for humankind, because, we were the center of the universe, and then we had the sun going around us, and then that wasn't true, and then we may not even be the only life form in the universe, and we become less and less important the more we learn about the reality around us. This sort of goes in the other direction.
Yeah, well, again, the other thing, too, is, you think about just a few hundred years ago, people used to say, this is, cliche, but the world was flat. And then when scientists or someone tried to say, well, wait a minute, it's really a round ball, but then the people would laugh and they'd go, well, if it's a round ball, you fool, you're going to fall off the bottom. And they didn't have this whole concept of, well, gravity. Well, how would you be at the bottom of the globe without falling off? And I think that that's more or less what's going on now, is we're turning the world inside out. And you're right. One of the big criticisms that I often hear is, this is, not biocentric, it's egocentric. We're making ourselves the center of things. And that, or my sister, when she died, they're saying, well, I'm just trying to grasp at straws, to make sense of it. I'm actually totally trying to look at this from a rational way and just to make sense of the facts. I'm not predisposed to it being this way or that way. Quite honestly, I'm very happy with the life I've lived. I have no real desire to live anymore. So it's not just a wishful hope on my part. It's simply just trying to make sense of all the observations, all of the facts, as intelligently as we can. And unfortunately, that doesn't always occur, particularly in science, where people have their entire life vested the way they think in a certain worldview, and it's very, very hard to once you've gone through all of this education, to just throw it away. It's just like a religion, it's like asking a priest about stem cell research. They're not always going to be open-minded about it.
Well, you're going to get a lot of people who are mad at you. I would imagine you already have a lot of people mad at you from all sides of the spectrum, right?
You're absolutely right. I mean, when you challenge people's views, it causes trouble. And my main goal here is just simply to make people think. That, well, maybe things aren't as black and white as you think. And and as you mentioned about the history of science, I mean, this is every generation has lived and died in illusions, and it has evolved. Back before Einstein, the world was looked at a certain way, and then then quantum theory came along, and then sort of bumped Einstein, and there's no reason to think that isn't going to continue. Hopefully, as we continue to accumulate more knowledge.
In the book, you have a chapter about consciousness, about how it's a mystery. Do you have a definition of consciousness? What it is? What we are?
Yeah, so I think what science tries to say is okay, you have this brain, this glob of cells, and it's just part of that circuitry. But of course, the real problem isn't that there's a neural correlate in your brain. It's how do you right now feel the alive sense. And the truth of the matter is that is tangled up with understanding the universe, and it's tangled up with understanding quantum physics. They're all part of a process. So consciousness actually is the process of space and time. It exists in it. So again, consciousness as this object that's out there. Again, it's a process that involves your consciousness. And so consciousness is indeed that process by which we establish a physical reality. So space and time, as I mentioned, are tools of the mind. And in the process of establishing you right now experiencing something, you by definition then have now, as the observer, created the logic for that. So you're talking to me, but at the same time that you're talking to me, there's an actual logic for that occurring. And then that is when you start extrapolating, and start saying, okay, this is what's happening and this is what's happening. But consciousness is indeed the process of what you right now are experiencing. And in that process, that is why all the physical events that we are aware of are actually observer dependent. I don't know if I'm making any sense. This is complicated stuff. Yeah.
Well, it is complicated. It's fun to talk about it, though, and kick it around. The central question, I guess the biggest question, the one that science and religion have been unable to really answer is what came before X. Big Bang Theory, what was there before the Big Bang? Well, there was nothing. There was no time, space, or anything. And my brain has trouble with that. And the same thing is true for religion. Well, God created all this. Well, where did God come from? And I don't have a good answer for that one either. Does biocentrism answer either of those?
Yeah, so what's happening is all knowledge of the universe, all knowledge that you possess, and I hate to reduce it to something that's cliche-ish, is relative. So everything has to be you think of something and nothingness. Well, how can you have a state of somethingness unless there's a state of nothingness to compare it to? Or, order and chaos. They're really just different parts of the circle. And Socrates a long time ago once said, define your terms. So I think we get ourselves into these traps because of our language, because of words that aren't making a lot of sense. So when you think of before and after, again, you're getting tripped up because we've been taught that space and time are these hard, cold objects out there. And as soon as you get away from that, you no longer have this problem of before and after. You realize that each of us is like a bubble of reality. Each of us, that, again, I like to think of it in just a guttural sense. How are we alive now on top of all of infinity? It just makes no sense that one in a gazillion chance that every single thing that could ever have happened, not just to mention all those laws that we talked about in the universe, but all the events that happened in evolution. Think about the meteor that fell to the earth that wiped out the dinosaurs that allowed for humans to evolve, or the Neanderthals that never happened. All of these gazillions of events that had all happened exactly right for you to be here talking to me. It's absurd to say that's just a mere accident. When you say something is just an accident, it means usually that you just don't understand why. You don't know what the reasoning is. And I think with biocentrism, more and more of that puzzle comes together, because then we do indeed realize that, you're not just here on top of infinity. That's just the way it seems to us. That's the way we perceive the world. And that when you die, again, you cannot connect one life with another life as though there was this invisible matrix out there and everything just happens out there ticking away like this big machine, because that isn't real. That isn't the real reality.
Wow, that's a lot to chew on, and I guess you could say that that's why we're here, is to kick these kinds of topics around, to think about them, to figure out who we are and what our purpose is, and you've certainly given us a lot to chew on. Dr. Robert Lanza is my guest. When we come back, we'll be opening up the phone lines. I know there's a lot of folks out there with questions, so stay with us here on Coast to Coast AM. So, can we capture time in a bottle? Maybe so, says my guest, Dr. Robert Lanza, author of the new book, Biocentrism. It'd be like putting the needle on the record player back to the beginning of that Jim Croce song, or to hear a different part of it, to play it again. Death, like reality, is illusory, he says. When we come back, we go to the phones, and I know a lot of you have questions. Stay with us on Coast to Coast AM. Thanks for being with us, everyone, tonight. We're going to the phones with your questions for Dr. Robert Lanza. Wildcard line, Bill in West Hartford, Connecticut. Hi, Bill.
Yes, hi, Doctor. Hi, this is Bill in West Hartford, Connecticut. I'm a scientific-minded atheist myself, and I have two quick, fascinating questions for you. I'll ask them together and then hang up and listen to your answer.
Okay.
Question number one, considering ETs, whether they're UFOs or ETs, extraterrestrials, trillions of miles away, light years away, when these intelligent beings that are undoubtedly out there, question number one, and they observed quasars or black holes or whatever, how does that affect us humans? And question number two, if intelligence or consciousness can be described as intelligent energy, and since, as you said, energy cannot be created or destroyed, you don't need a God to create our minds because it exists always, and we don't die, as you said, when the body dies, but you also, like I said, don't need a God to create us in the first place.
Yes. So on your first question about ET, I think that ET would be no different than you looking up at the sky. And so, again, when any extraterrestrial intelligence or human or an animal observes something, that reality is collapsed. And together with that, all the spatial temporal logic, and that also includes the individuals who may have been part of that past. So it doesn't mean that they will necessarily change your timeline because, again, space and time are relative to each individual observer. So that ET may collapse something, and indeed that reality becomes real to ET. Your reality is real to you, and the mistake we often make is that this intersubjective objectivity that we think of in our science books doesn't really work that way. So again, observer dependent reality, it begins and ends with each individual observer. And as far as consciousness, you're absolutely right. You don't need a God to collapse that. You're living proof of that. I mean, the fact that your consciousness exists is an information system that exists in its own right. It's just the nature of the creature, and where we stumble into problems is that when we say there's something and nothingness, and they're just simply not understanding the complete circle.
Thanks, Bill. Wild card 2, Jim in the truck. Jim, I hope we're making your drive a little more interesting tonight.
Yeah, I don't need these two. There you go. Up here in Toronto, and I'm out of New Bedford, Mass, and I listen to you guys all the time, call in all the time, too. Yeah, I just want to say, I'm a Christian, and I don't believe what this guy Robert's saying, and agree to disagree with him, but the Bible says that it's appointed unto man once to die and then the judgment. So you could go to one of two places, and the way I believe that is that I know that I'm just a creature, and I'm not the creator. I know that the job's taken. So I understand God's real by the prophecies that are coming to pass today. But what do you basically believe, Robert? You believe that there's reincarnation? Is that what you believe?
Well, what you need to understand is whether it's science or religion, we're very primitive creatures. We're like chipmunks and squirrels. We can only comprehend the universe to a certain degree. So your religious beliefs that you have about judgment and being punished or not being punished, there's an element of truth as much as we're able to grasp. Likewise, there are elements of science that are correct. And again, we can talk about the Eastern philosophies about reincarnation. So again, we're very primitive creatures, and there are elements of truth depending on how you define your terms and how it's framed. So I'm not going to dismiss your belief system because, indeed, much of what you believe, there's probably very real evidence that would suggest that there's truth to it. But it doesn't mean that there isn't truth to other ways of thinking as well.
They're not mutually exclusive.
Exactly.
Okay. Thanks for the call out there, Jim in the truck. Be careful out there on the roads. Bill in Florida, you're on the line with Dr. Robert Lanza.
Hi, guys. My question is, I happen to I happen to know for a fact that I've changed some parts of some parts of physical reality. I've done it many times, actually. It's not like I can levitate, don't get me wrong, but I have changed reality. Can you explain that? Can you explain how I've done that?
Well, the problem, unfortunately, is as much as my ideas may stretch your way of thinking, in the end, I was trained the old-fashioned way as a scientist, and so the cause and effect seems to, always play out in the world that I've experienced. So I'm not really sure how you're saying you're changing reality. So, yes, indeed, there are ways that you might interpret that, but I'm not sure of the specific episode you're talking about, so I can't really try to give you an explanation.
Bill, if you're still on the line there, can you tell us how you changed it?
Okay. I'll give you an example. I've taken a paper towel and turned it into a real towel. How did I do that?
That's a good question. If you can do that, I know some people that may want to hire you to sell your product. No, honestly, I don't have an explanation for that. I can't do it all the time. I cannot do it all the time. I cannot do it at will. But I have exactly done things like that at least 20, 30, 40 times in my life. And I've never figured out how that's possible. But I'm thinking to myself that maybe when you're talking about molecules and you're talking about everything else, that there's a way to do that. And like I said, I've never figured out how I did it. I've never figured out, it's not like it was an illusion. It's not like it was a hallucination. I've actually done it. Okay. Well, I take your word for it. I just know as a scientist I haven't encountered that kind of a phenomenon. I'm not saying that it's not possible, just that it's not something that I personally could explain to you.
But, Bill, you'd have a heck of a future here if you had that talent. You could move here to Las Vegas. They'd probably bar you from the casinos, though. Thanks for the call. On the international line, Dave. Hi, Dave. How you doing? What's on your mind?
Hey, pretty good, thanks. I'd just like to say with programs like this, it's Coast to Coast is the beacon in the dark night. I'm telling you, guys are great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the religious vein about Romans 12:2 says that God has a good, acceptable, and perfect will, which means there's like three wills, which would kind of make you think you have more than one reality if He has a good, acceptable, and perfect will, if anybody wants to look that one up. But what I wanted to mention was an incident that happened to me. I had a near-death experience where I almost died, yet my mother and twin sister had a premonition that night that they were going to get a call the next day that I did die, yet obviously I didn't. And just the last question I was going to say, the question is that if we can have a perfect existence or reality, how can we get that ideal reality? And if I'm in my ideal reality now, are you guys just bit players in it, or are you guys in your ideal reality as well as me?
Hey, this is my movie.
I think a lot of what you're speaking of more has to do with meaning, and choosing the things that are important to you, and that's really an individual thing as to what each person considers to be of most value in their life.
He mentioned near-death experiences, premonitions. A topic we've talked about a lot on this program, ESP. All these things, time slips, things like that. Are there these aberrations where these different realities intercede on our own, do you think?
Yeah, I think that there's no question that you can, have distortions of space and time, and, any sort of person who may have taken LSD or something, would know, or even if you had some alcohol, that you had a distorted sense of reality, that clearly there are ways of perceiving what's going on different than the way we're perceiving them today. But what I can also say is that, through evolutionary biology, that animals probably sense things, and, the more primitive ones in one dimension, and then a little higher 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions. So that, how we experience space and time and what's going on, there'd be a lot of very interesting turns and twists, and I think the physicists can attest to, they talk about one-dimensional cracks in space. I'm not sure I agree with all of this, but there's a lot out there, with the string theory, and some of these theories actually envision 6 dimensions curled up at every point in space like soda straws. Again, these are mathematical theories. theories and how they translate into our everyday world, you'd have to ask them. But, my guess is that they're only under very extreme conditions.
Okay, east of the Rockies, Dave in Kentucky. Hi, Dave.
Good evening, gentlemen. Good to talk to you.
Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, couple of quick comments. First of all, with the reality being based on the perception of the observer, wouldn't that kind of mean that all religions are true?
Well, when I mean observer determined, I'm not really meaning, that you actually create the reality you want. What we mean is that the actual properties of particles are dependent on the observer, so that if the observer makes this or that decision, it will impact those particular properties. Again, whether you're discerning the location or the momentum of a particle. What it doesn't mean is that you can go out there and just make whatever reality you want, because there still are the laws of causality and the interactions that you and I know occur in our everyday life.
Okay. Understand. There was a comment you made earlier about how, if gravity was just a tiny bit different,
yes,
it would change the properties of the universe and there would be no us.
Right.
And such. I've always thought that was kind of a backwards way of looking at it. Not so much that the universe is developed perfectly for us, but that we adapted perfectly to the universe as it existed.
Well, what we're saying by these constants, and you mentioned gravity, is that there wouldn't be a universe for us to adapt to. In other words, if the gravitational constant was ever so slight, there wouldn't have been stars, there wouldn't have been all the things that we know in the universe. And then you can look at, again, one after the other parameter, one after the other law, all four of the forces of nature. And what you find is that they're just simply the probability that there would even be a universe is so infinitesimally tiny, if you said it was random, that there would be nothing for us to evolve to. So this is why, there's a concern. John Wheeler had what's called an anthropic principle, which is saying the observer participates in that reality. But this is why people were saying, there's a God, that this is intelligent design, because our current scientific model doesn't explain those. And yes, I know where you're coming from when you say, well, okay, we just evolved to these things. But we're talking about the actual laws of the universe that could be any value, and yet they're precisely this or that at every step of the way. And so the question is that is almost statistically an impossibility to have occurred.
Dave, thank you. Those were good observations. West of the Rockies, Luis in San Diego. Hi, Luis.
Hi, how you doing tonight?
Okay.
Hello.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if this was the right kind of concept, but as far as time is concerned, I was thinking not to the left or the right, or kind of time is above us, and like say going back in time or going in the future, is it being able to get into that place that time is, so you could go back in time or go in the future in time, but we don't have enough knowledge to do it right now. He's fascinated by the whole thing of time travel.
Yeah, I think, again, you're touching on an interesting topic, and that is that space and time indeed are algorithms in our mind. And once we understand consciousness and how we put this whole thing together in our minds, that's where neurophysiology will come into play. We'll eventually understand how to make those information systems work, for artificial intelligence. And once we do that, we can tamper with those algorithms, perhaps, so that you could almost think about time in an extra dimension where you could actually walk through time very much like you walk through space. So again, as I mentioned, through evolutionary biology, there are probably animals that experience reality in one dimension, two dimension. We experience it in three. And my guess is should we gain knowledge in, the coming millennia, we probably will know how to manipulate those algorithms so we can do exactly that.
Thanks, Luis. Appreciate it. First-time caller Jacob in New Mexico. Hi, Jacob. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, I'm a big fan, by the way. Two questions.
Thank you.
As far as time and stuff like that. Like you said, it doesn't exist or whatever. But innuendos, premonitions, deja vu, does it all relate to like meeting the same person? As far as what I'm getting at is, are we destined to meet each other along the way? Like as far as
what's your take on destiny?
Destiny. That's a big one. I think I could look at that from both directions, depending on the logic. Again, order and chaos is there a will or is there not? And I think that there is a destiny from a certain perspective for sure, absolutely. Is there scenarios where I could think that may not go along those lines? Yes. So I think a lot of this is from the direction you're looking at that. I know I'm sounding confusing, but it basically depends on your way of viewing what's going on.
Jacob, did he get to the heart of your question? Jacob's gone. Okay, we're going to go to Bob in Eagle Rock, California on a wild card line. Hi, Bob.
Hey.
Good morning, or good evening.
Bob. Yeah, it's Robert. I'm in Oklahoma City. I got a comment and then a question, but I didn't know if this is following along the same lines you're talking about, but, with the economy the way it is and everything, I was at work one night driving around downtown here, and I told my coworker, I said, we really need another skyscraper on our skyline, and they're building one of the top 10 tallest skyscrapers west of the Mississippi right now, and this happened about 6 months, and I didn't read anything in a paper about it or anything like that. And now all of a sudden we're getting a skyscraper. I've been here all my life, and they haven't built one since I've been alive, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm 40 years old. And then another instance is like on the west side of town, there's this old AT&T plant that shut down when, AT&T went bust. Mm-hmm. And I said, it would be really cool if I could buy this property here and turn it into a mall. They're building a mall there now. Okay. Uh-huh. Now, what I'm wondering, is there a way to hone these skills to make it into that you can change reality to benefit your own destiny, right? Because I have a lot of ideas that I want to do. Like I said, I would like to build a mall there, but it didn't happen for me. Somebody else is doing it. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. But it seems like I can speak things and then they happen. It's really odd. And there's several people that witnessed it, and they're like, man, that's just really weird that you said this, and now they're doing it, right?
Well, let me add to Robert's comment there for you, Dr. Lanza, is there, you think there's a mechanism, the same way as that particles at great distance have some sort of an instantaneous connection, there's some way that in this particular reality we occasionally can be catching glimpses of other realities in connection sort of with ourself in some other reality, and where Robert's mall has already been built, he's getting the idea from the other Robert.
It's an interesting question, and it's just so much we don't understand.
Yeah.
So, I think it's a possibility. It's not something that I right now would be able to explain to you or would be able to say how that would happen. I wouldn't rule it out, though.
Tell me this. We've only got about a minute here left. I'm sure a lot of people in our listening audience right now are mad at you or they have questions. You're not out to convert or convince. I get the feeling you're more out to get us thinking in about 30 seconds.
Exactly. That's exactly what this is. It's to open people's minds, to get them to start thinking about these things and to realize that things aren't exactly the way they may have been taught to them in their school books. And right. So, yes, think.
Dr. Robert Lanza, thanks very much. The book is called Biocentrism. I think it was really interesting. I appreciate you coming on the program, and we'll have you back again sometime.
Great. Thank you very much.
All right, everyone, stay with us. David Paulides is going to be here next to talk about his book, Tribal Bigfoot, and some new forensic research he's conducting. Don't go away. More to come on Coast to Coast. You know him, you love him. He's the big guy, Sasquatch. He's known by dozens of different names all over the world. People have been seeing creatures like this for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. He's been seen in every state of this country and on every continent on this planet. Different sizes, different colors, but all sort of having some of the same kinds of characteristics. A humanoid, hairy humanoid figure that has perplexed us and bewildered us for a long time. Is this a solvable mystery? Can we get evidence that would prove it one way or another? Well, David Paulides brings his 20 years of law enforcement, investigative, and analytical skills to this kind of research. He's written 2 excellent books about the search for Bigfoot. And when we come back, we'll jump right into the state of Bigfoot research right now. Stay with us on Coast to Coast AM. Last year, I had David Paulides on the program to talk about his most recent book, Tribal Bigfoot, and it's pretty impressive. It's impressive work. This is an elusive mystery. It's confounding. It's frustrating. Been around a long time, and nobody can seem to get to the bottom of it, but David has approached this sort of like a cop would approach it, going out, interviewing the witnesses, following the evidence where it leads. Tell me this, David. We're glad to have you back on the show, by the way.
Well, I'm glad I got with you there, George. I appreciate the offer.
Is this a solvable mystery?
Absolutely. For many years, there's been a lot of people that have taken different venues and ideas trying to understand how they can come to some resolution with it. And from the get-go, we started off understanding that DNA would probably be the solution. And we first tracked to the idea that we wanted to understand what we were dealing with. And the best way to do that, when I look back on my law enforcement career, was utilizing a law enforcement forensic artist to sit down with witnesses and draw exactly what the witness observed. And this hadn't been done before by other researchers. And because of my expertise in dealing in that venue, I knew that a good forensic artist, when they sat down with a witness, would draw exactly what the witness saw. And we chose Harvey Pratt from Oklahoma, and Harvey is the chief forensic artist for the state of Oklahoma, and as of a month ago, he is now the director for the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation. He's a man of incredible integrity and an absolutely outstanding artist. And every time Harvey sits down with somebody, when they're done, they are amazed that Harvey can get this out of them and show exactly what they observed.
And, what struck me the first time I saw his drawings is how human some of these faces look.
And, George, that is something that intrigued us the first night, because there's so many stories out there about this is an ape, this is a gorilla. But then once you start to talk to the Native Americans, and I don't mean just one tribal group, I mean across North America and Canada, of course, you start to listen to what they have to say, and they have never stated that this is an ape or a gorilla. They've always stated that this is another tribe of Native Americans. They look a little different. They act a little different. They're a little more elusive, but they're another tribe of people. And once the drawings started to show consistency, and I'm not talking maybe 5 or 10 drawings, I'm talking dozens and dozens of drawings, and sitting down with the witnesses and listening to their descriptive analysis of their own drawing, it's obvious that these things have some type of genetics that are similar, if not exactly parallel with ours.
I want to, a lot of folks, of course, write this off. They say it's all a hoax. It started in 1958 where somebody hoaxed some guys on a work crew in the forest up there in Northern California, created these tracks, and it's sort of developed a life of its own ever since. There have been hoaxed films and hoaxed footprints and things of that sort. I thought the most interesting, some of the most interesting parts of your book, Tribal Bigfoot, is the historical research that goes way, way back, long before there were any kind of mass media influence telling people to believe in Bigfoot.
Absolutely. And people don't even have to purchase the book to see some type of historical revelation. If you go to our website, and there's a segment there on the Tule River Indian Reservation in sort of south central California near Fresno, and they have an area right next to a river that archaeologists have dated it back almost 1,500 years. And the pictures are on the website of what the drawings are that this tribe put on these rocks. And they look just like Bigfoot. And when you talk to the elders, they say, yep, our ancestors drew these because they were caretakers of the woods. They took care of us. They kept the grizzly bears away, and they took care of our tribe. And darn, if you don't look at those drawings and you say, well, 1,500 years ago, these people were drawing exactly what we're seeing today. And there's a consistency down along the lines. You know, even in the 1700s, there are newspaper articles about big, hairy monsters or big, hairy people that were chasing others and stealing livestock.
Isn't there a story about Teddy Roosevelt having an encounter?
There absolutely is, yeah. And talks about a couple of guys that were trappers that were down in a river, and one of them got taken apart, essentially dismembered. And he talks about another time where he was on a trip and he heard a shriek and a sound that he and the other people he were with, which were trappers and guides, had never heard before and didn't understand it and couldn't put it with any animal that was known in the woods.
Going back to the historical records, you came across this resource, this book from 1916 by a Yurok woman named Lucy Thompson. Tell us about that.
Well, that fits so sweetly into where I was working predominantly. I was up near the Hoopa Indian Reservation up in Northern California. I'd made good friends there, and it was just a good base of knowledge. It's about 30 miles south of Bluff Creek, where Patterson and Gimlin made their film. And doing some research, we found out that this woman, Lucy, very well-educated Yurok woman, lived on the Klamath River, and she wrote about her experiences, and they were across the board. How it was living there, how it was trying to get by, some of the perils of living along the river. And then she talked about these things called Indian devils. And the Indian devils are described as coming into their village at night, sometimes stealing food, sometimes waiting until the male warriors left for the day to go kill deer, etc. And when they were gone during the day, the Indian devils sometimes would come down and take a woman, take a young girl, take a child. And they would take them for different reasons. And sometimes the warriors would go out and get them back. Sometimes they would find them charred and cannibalized. And it almost sounded as though that it was on a need basis. Sometimes they needed a mate, and they would take one. Sometimes, maybe during a hard winter, they would take one to eat. But there was a consistency in the story when we started to step across the U.S. and talk about other tribes. Same thing was happening in Washington. Same thing was happening in Oklahoma. There is that consistency to the story that cannot be ignored.
Well, when you say that they called them devils, that makes me wonder about the nature of the relationship between Native American tribes and whatever these things are. Because, you know, you read some accounts and they refer to them as our brothers in the forest kind of a thing, and they come and watch over us and help us. And then something like that where they steal children and eat them. That doesn't sound like brothers in the forest.
And that's a good point. And a very well-educated Indian elder once told me, said, Dave, it's sometimes hard to understand and reconcile that. But imagine this, that if you were a group of, say, 50 humans living in a village, and you had a problem child that you couldn't tame and you couldn't take care of, and you excommunicated them from your group and you said, get out of here, you go live someplace else. Well, probably that happened because they couldn't live by your rules. And once they left, they didn't have to live by anybody's rules anymore. So if you can imagine, and I know this is hard for some viewers to grasp, but if you buy the line that Bigfoot, Sasquatch has these human genetics in it, and every once in a while a semi-civilized group excommunicates one and tells them to leave. Well, maybe it's that rogue one out there that can't be tamed and can't be civilized out there and does bad things because, hey, we know in human genetics, we've got bad people, too, that do some horrendous things.
Well, you mentioned in the accounts of this Yurok woman, Lucy Thompson, they claim that she alleges that the creature, whatever it's called, is a shapeshifter, that it can change its form, that it can become other animals. And I want you to address that specifically, but also in this context is, do you take this account literally, that she is describing things that really happened, or as more like a folklore?
I think most of it probably really happened. And when Harvey and I went back to Oklahoma and Harvey has Native American himself. He broke down some ground for us so we could talk to some elders face to face and get what we believe to be the truth about it. There were these shapeshifters, according to the elders, back 100 years ago. And as time has moved forward, they're harder and harder to find, although they supposedly do exist. And I think that could have been a way at times for them to reconcile this in their mind, how odd the behavior is, how unusual it is. And trust me, they do have some unusual behavior, and they have some abilities that we don't have. But if you can reconcile that by calling him a shapeshifter, but when you talk to the elders, that's very, very rare, even in their community 100, 200 years ago, to find somebody that could do that. It wasn't common.
Well, shape-shifting, does that account for all the different kinds of descriptions? I mean, you have so many different kinds in the book, Tribal Bigfoot, different colors, different shapes of the head, different look of the face. Are there just a whole bunch of different species? Is that your guess, or sort of offshoots, or do they look different to different people?
Well, let's think about the human race for a second and say,
sure,
if I put you in the middle of Beijing, China, and I said, grab the 3 closest people to you in Beijing, and then we go to the middle of the Senegal desert, and I say, grab 3 of the closest people to you, and then we go to an NBA basketball game, and I say, step onto the middle of the NBA floor and grab 3 of the closest players to you. How different are those people going to look when you stand them next to each other? And if you understand how different human genetics is and how many different races we have in and amongst ourselves, when you start to look at the Bigfoot phenomena, whether it's called Almasty in Russia or Yeti in Nepal, these bipeds exist on every continent and in many, many, many countries. And it's just not a 20th century issue. It goes back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So if you have that genetic evolution and that change, and if every once in a while they grab a human against their will, as Lucy described, and they use them as a wife, and they try to have kids with them, then eventually those genetics are going to get involved, and everybody's going to look a little different. If all of these Bigfoot looked exactly alike, that would be suspect. But having them have that differentiation that you would find in human genetics, in people, in communities, it makes more sense to us.
I don't want to beat this too much into the ground, but I'd like to go back to these historical cases and ask you to address the significance of historical cases. When you go back hundreds of years, pre-mass media, hysteria kinds of things, when it is obvious that the people who are seeing these things are not trying to sell their story to the National Enquirer, what are they describing, and what is the significance in that in terms of evidence for you?
Well, there's a very famous case where David Thompson was an explorer, and he was up near Jasper, Alberta, Canada in the 1700s, and he got onto some tracks, and he was with guides at the time, and they found these giant human-type tracks with a huge stride in the absolute middle of nowhere. And Thompson wrote about him several times and talked about him later in his life, how he couldn't reconcile what it was. And other people said, oh, it's just a giant grizzly or something. And he came back and he said several times, no, it couldn't have been a grizzly. And it bothered him at that level. Then if you go back to Tule River and you say, well, 1,500 years ago they had these things drawn on walls, and they look identical to what a silhouette of a Bigfoot Sasquatch is today. And if you can think, well, a lot of people put all the relevance into what Jerry Crew named Bigfoot in 1958 up at Bluff Creek. And really, it's just been everybody falsifying and hoaxing ever since. But if you go back in the record, even to the starting of newspapers, there are these stories. Trappers in trapper journals, when the people came over on the boats to the California coast, there are talks about them hitting land and running up against hairy giant people. Same thing on the East Coast. And one of the things we did early on was not only did we do our research on the researchers in this field, but we also did that historical search to try to understand how much validity we can put into it before we move forward. And it was overwhelming how much there is. And I put it in tribal because I want people to understand that there is background to this that's valid, and there's this historical record that if you just kind of match the lines on a map, just like you match the lines on a pin drawing of crimes, you can see that it starts to make sense. It didn't all happen on the West Coast. It's been going on throughout the United States and Canada for years. There's not one climate or one elevation where they proliferate and they don't exist. They exist sometimes in the desert areas of Southern California.
Well, it's just like other kinds of controversial paranormal mysteries, UFOs. You have a lot of folks who get involved in it and want to mess with other people's minds, hoaxers who maybe want to make a buck, or they just want attention. I remember these guys, what was it, 2 years ago or 3 years ago maybe, who claimed that they had Bigfoot in their freezer, and it was obviously described as a hoax. And then you have cases like the Patterson film, the most famous Bigfoot film, that really has passed a lot of tests and that a lot of people believe to be legitimate, but it also gets thrown into the mix and gets muddied up. Wasn't there somebody who came forward with the deathbed confession that we made it up?
I've heard so many different stories from different people, but what I tell anybody is I say, if you give me 4 hours of your time, I'll make you a believer that Patterson film is absolutely a photo of a living hairy biped. Those guys did a phenomenal job. They were unbelievably lucky. And as I've spoke about at conferences, it was like the perfect storm for Bigfoot. These guys not only got a Bigfoot, they got a Bigfoot in the middle of an open area. They got him open for 30, 40, 50 seconds. They found one that was extremely hairy and didn't run. It stood there and walked across an open area. It was next, at the beginning when the film started, it was semi-near a wooded area and could have turned and disappeared into it. For some reason it didn't. It stayed out in the gravel bed and walked the entire distance and gave him an opportunity to film it. And what I tell people is I say, what are the odds of today a person walking through the woods that has some kind of video device compared to 1967? It's got to be enormous. We all have something on us these days that has a video device. But you know what? That film hasn't been duplicated. No one has gotten good footage of a Bigfoot since 1967.
So what are you saying, that thing wanted to be filmed?
I have no idea. I'm just saying that there's peculiarities about it that strike as highly unusual, and these guys were very, very lucky. Great weather, an open area. It stayed out in the open. They were able to film it. My gosh, how lucky is that?
What about the deathbed confession? Am I remembering that correctly?
Never had one from
Patterson?
From Patterson, no.
I thought there was somebody else in that story who came forward to saying that he was close to them and they had made it up or something.
There's been a few people that have written books trying to take away the credibility, but honestly, once you look at that film frame by frame and you see the muscles move and it flex as it puts its foot down, and there's a couple injuries on it that it would have been impossible to make that in 1967 with the degree of definition that there was. Even today, I think it would be very, very difficult.
I'd like to get your take on the whole idea of hoaxes and who would be threatened by this becoming scientifically proven. You know, you got the UFO field that I deal with quite a bit, and there are those for whom their worldview would be greatly upset. There are national security implications why people would want to muddy those waters, even cover it up, and a lot of evidence to suggest that has happened. I just wonder who is threatened by a Bigfoot being proven beyond any doubt.
Well, we've talked about that a lot because in the last 6 months we've filed probably 20 or 25 different Freedom of Information Act requests
Hey, I'll tell you what, David, that music tells us we're taking a break, and it sounded like you were coming up to something good. So hold that thought. We'll get back to it after this on Coast to Coast AM. Stay with us. Thanks for being with us, everyone. Tonight we're talking with David Paulides. He's one of the world's foremost experts on Bigfoot research. He's also the author of two books. One, the latest one being Tribal Bigfoot. Excellent book. It sort of is a state of the evidence argument regarding Bigfoot. It looks at what kinds of evidence exist from the prints and eyewitnesses and police sketches and descriptions, a little bit of film footage. What is it going to take to prove this beyond all doubt? How about DNA evidence? We'll get into that topic, and later on we'll be bringing in a colleague of David's, Dr. Melba Ketchum, to talk about the difficulties of trying to secure DNA evidence regarding Bigfoot. Stay with us, everyone, for more Coast to Coast AM. Before the break, David, I was asking you who might be threatened by Bigfoot's reality being confirmed. Why would somebody go out of their way to muddy the waters or belittle the whole thing or ridicule people like you?
That's the million-dollar question, George. And step back a little bit now. I'll give you a broader view of how we got to some of the answers to that question. Is if you look at the Patterson-Gimlin film, another oddity to it is that they caught a female Bigfoot. And our guess is maybe 1 out of every 10 sightings by a witness is a female. So it's a rare occurrence. So that's another part of the enigma of that film. So we were in Yakima, Washington, and I was meeting with Patricia Patterson. And Patricia has 5 plates that were made from the original Patterson-Gimlin film. And these plates are highly developed, meaning the picture that you can get off this plate is probably 10 or 15 times better than taking a photo of the frame of the film. And some people had gone up before us and had it scanned, and they did it at a very low resolution. We took the whole day, and at the absolute highest resolution, we got copies of these scans, and we gave them to some people to study. Well, while I was there, 2 of us walked into the shop that rented Roger Patterson the camera that took the film. And one of the guys is one of the owner's sons, is still there. And I asked him if there's anything unusual that never really came out of this regarding the camera. And he says, well, the most unusual thing is he said when he was 14 years old, the FBI, 2 agents came inside of his store when he and his dad were working there and asked to see the camera that Roger Patterson rented. And his dad said he didn't have it. And the agent said, well, can you get it? And his dad said, well, I don't know if I can because I'm not exactly sure where it's at. And he said, but why can't I just give you a similar camera and that'll probably do the trick for you? And the agent said, no, we want that camera. And he said, well, why do you want that camera? And he said that they wanted to measure the speed that film was set at to understand how fast that biped was walking. And so that was almost 2 years ago now I was there. And we immediately came back and filed a Freedom of Information Act request on the FBI files associated with that request. And we write these very well because we have a couple friends that are agents that told us, if you write specific language, they're going to give you specific things, and if you don't, they're going to give you a lot of garbage. And we rewrote that thing 4 different times, and 4 different times the FBI said there's no such record of anybody visiting that shop, no such record of any investigation into Patterson, Gimlin, or the footage. And we have literally probably written 60, 70 different letters about this to them, and they claim that there's nothing and that they've never had an interest in it.
Well, what do you make of that? The alternative being that somebody posing as FBI agents was up there? Or
No.
You think it was the FBI?
No, because we've been in other locations and people have told us that the FBI came in and asked them about things related to Bigfoot. And let's go back to that Patterson-Gimlin film for a minute. So there's a certain frame there where the biped turns and looks right at the camera. And one of the plates we have, very high resolution. It's a perfect picture of this thing turning around and looking. So Harvey Pratt is an expert of, say, taking a bank robbery photo where a guy puts on a beard and mustache and goes in and robs a bank. Well, Harvey can go in and take the beard and the mustache off the person and let everyone see what he looks like without the costume on. So we came back and we said, Harvey, can you do this with this picture? He said, yeah. And then he looked at it and he said, whoa, you guys are onto something. So he took the hair off, and it's in Tribal Bigfoot, the drawing. And to me, what it looks like is it looks a lot like a Native American man. And to that point, if you go back to what the Native Americans in Washington and in British Columbia said in the 20s, that this is another tribe, and if you listen to what Lucy said about them interbreeding, it all starts to fall together, that these things have this genetic line. But they also have an enormous ability to speed and strength that obvious humans don't have.
Well, back to my original question on this point is still the why part of muddying the waters. If the FBI was up there asking for that camera, why? I mean, why is that a threat to anybody? Wouldn't it be just kind of a cool thing and the whole world would go, wow, that's really interesting?
Well, I'm not sure how many viewers or even if you knew this, but back in the Cold War era, Russia was looking at the possibility of using ape and gorilla hybrids as military people. And a lot of the scientists out in Russia that were studying the Almasty or the Bigfoot of Russia thought that there was a possibility that they were trying to maybe use some parallel Almasty as a soldier. So maybe that there was some person in the government that heard that Russia was doing this there and said, well, maybe we should be looking into this as well. But you brought up a good question about why our government would be concerned or why would they want to keep this a secret. And I think the obvious starts to come out the more you listen to governmental reps' stories about why these things aren't recorded in official docs. And we've talked to a lot of rangers who have had sightings, and they're told by their supervisors, don't write it down. And I just interviewed a guy the other day, worked for the National Park Service. Supervisor told him, don't write it down. And if you think about the government's control over everything, very rarely does the government ever want to say, we can't control the situation. If there ever is a situation that they can't control, it's Bigfoot in the woods of the world, because they have no control. They may have some knowledge that they're not telling us about, but obviously their speed, their ability to conceal themselves, the ability to use languages that we don't understand, but some Native Americans do. If they said, hey, are we safe out there? How can the government say yes or no if they can't even claim that they exist?
I know you're not crazy about getting into some of the more exotic parts of the Bigfoot story, but there are, kind of some anecdotal indications that these creatures have ESP abilities or other kinds of exotic abilities. Do you take those stories seriously?
I will tell you what the newspaper articles in the 20s said. And a group of 3 different tribes got together, and they actually held a press conference because they heard that some sheriff was going to go out and hunt these things. And they stated that, hey, they have the ability to mimic animals in the forest. So sounds you may hear really aren't the sounds you may be thinking, like owls and other birds and things, but they're Bigfoots communicating with each other. And they don't look a lot like us because they're real hairy and they're real big, but generally they're passive unless you try to hurt them or unless you get them mad. So don't go out there and try to hunt them. And then you hear these stories about people, and I've heard so many that they're sleeping in a tent, and they feel the rumble, and that's how it's described many times, of these things walking up at their campsite because they're so heavy, 800-900 pounds. And they feel the earth move a little bit, and then they feel it right next to their tent. And it runs the gamut. What people, they have a feeling of immense fright, so much so that sometimes they can't move. Sometimes there's horrific odor associated with it. Very rarely is the tent ever touched or assaulted, but every once in a while it is. But the general thing is that they can't move. And maybe maybe there is something to that. I don't know, but until we understand it, or until we have some kind of chemical analysis of what's going on in the air or something along those lines, it's really hard to put our finger on what may be causing that. But I do know, because I have been in law enforcement situations myself, I've been pretty scared many times. Not to the point of where I can't move, but maybe your thinking is impaired at some level where, you're maybe not as reacting as fast as you would in a normal situation because you're trying to understand what may be occurring to you. It's hard to say.
Isn't there, back to the Patterson film, isn't there a reaction by the horse or the animals, the pack animals in that film to what's the creature out there in that field?
Yeah,
or am I remembering that wrong?
No, that's correct. Whether the horse fell or whether Patterson fell off the horse, he did go down on the ground, and that caused a big disruption. If you talk to Native Americans, they will tell you that if you want a better chance of seeing a Bigfoot, you ride in on a horse because the human odor's up off the ground. And I interviewed a wife of an individual named Syl McCoy, and Syl was the head of the U.S. Forest Service station in Willow Creek in the 50s and 60s. And Syl was an amateur researcher himself, and he and Bob Titmus one day decided they were going to try to see a Bigfoot because there were certain tracks that were coming out of the Trinity River at this one location. And these guys were smart enough to get up in a Douglas fir tree 100, 150 feet up out of the air and sit there all night because they knew getting themselves up off the ground, they would have a better chance. And I will tell all researchers out there, that is the correct way to go. Because you talk to natives, you talk to the older researchers, you got to get that odor up off the ground, and a Bigfoot will walk right by. And the best example is you can read dozens of sighting reports from people in deer stands. Hunters in deer stands see them.
Before we leave the subject of the cover-up or muddying the waters thing, you mentioned that you'd filed all these FOIA requests. Did you ever get anything out of any agency, Park Service or FBI or anyone else that mentions Bigfoot, Sasquatch, anything like this?
We got some, and in one of the books I included a report from the Army Corps of Engineers out of Washington, but that wasn't from a FOIA request. It was more of our own research where they talked about Bigfoot in an almanac that was produced by the Army Corps of Engineers in Washington. And they talked about it like it was a real being, so that was interesting. But we have laid into it heavily in just the last 6 months, just like with a razor-fine edge, asking specific questions on specific issues at specific locations. And this ranger that we interviewed the other day, I got that from a U.S. Forest Service law enforcement officer who heard that this guy had actually seen one. We went and interviewed him. He goes, I'll go on camera with him. I'll explain what happened. But there were 3 of us in this one area. We all saw one at different times. We were told not to report it. Nobody wanted to hear about it. Why?
Huh. And the paperwork, whatever was, there is no paper trail, at least in that case. They were just discouraged.
Correct.
Help me while we're waiting sort of to set things up for Dr. Ketchum to come on, give me the state of the evidence, what exists. I mean, we all know that there are these prints and that moldings have been made, and we know that there are eyewitness reports and police sketches, as in your book, Tribal Bigfoot. We know there's a little bit of film footage. What other kinds of evidence do we have, and what would be the Holy Grail? Is it hair?
I honestly think that there's several different factors that could be considered the Holy Grail. Let's look at the footprints for a second. There's an individual named Jimmy Chilcott out of Texas that was a police technician, and there's something called dermal ridges in a person's foot, kind of like the fingerprint of the foot. And in several casts going back decades, he found these dermal ridges in the casts of these large, giant prints. And literally, those couldn't be faked or hoaxed. And he made several presentations that I've seen where he said, "Hey, these are real footprints from a real creature, but they're not made by a human print because the dermal ridges go at an angle that human ridges don't." So that's one thing. Now, hair offers us some real obstacles. And I've got the best lesson of probably anybody out there because I've been at this now for 27 months with Dr. Ketchum and her staff. In a human hair, 95% of human hair has a medulla in it. The medulla is a solid core that goes down the center of the hair, and in that is our DNA. And at the follicle level, there's nuclear DNA. And maybe 4 or 5% of the human hair doesn't have this medulla in it, and it's absent. Well, it's almost opposite for Bigfoot hair. Maybe 98 or 99% of Bigfoot hair, if it has a medulla, the DNA in it is so fragmented, is so minimal that it's not workable. And until we've got multiple samples, and we tried this over and over again, it just doesn't work. And so what I tell everybody, if you have a hair and it doesn't have a follicle at the end, it's worthless for getting DNA at a Sasquatch Bigfoot level. We need the follicle. And the follicle obviously is the core, the root that goes into the body. And unfortunately, for Bigfoot hairs, very small percentage of these hairs have follicles. Whether it's the way the hair comes out, whether it falls out at some level very easily, we don't know. But we've been lucky. We have some samples out of Oregon, some out of California, some out of Alaska, and some out of Mid-America that are good samples. And that started it off working with Dr. Ketchum. And she has been one person that has shown an exorbitant amount of energy and interest, because people that are hair and fiber experts have seen these hairs and they've ruled that they are like nothing else out there in the world. And there's no other animal, there's no other human that could have a hair like this. They look a lot like primate hairs, but there's no primate out there that has this exact kind of hair. And this has been stated before, and this isn't really anything new. But I suppose when she hears it from somebody that she deems credible, and he raises her interest level like he did way back when we started this, and now she starts to get into the DNA extraction from follicles of hairs, and it starts to raise her interest even more when she starts to have some strange returns come back. And I wrote about those in Tribal. And she will explain what those odd ups and downs mean and where we're going today. But we've been lucky. We've got some bone. I just submitted a bone to her the other day. And some other people have brought in some other samples. So we have some tissue samples and some other things that are looking very, very promising.
Well, we'll save that part of the discussion for when she joins us. I'd like to ask you, next couple of minutes before the break, why we don't have certain things, like a carcass, like a skeleton, like a dead Bigfoot that's shot by a hunter out there, all those kinds of things that the critics demand. Where are they?
So we've come to this resolution just in the last year that there's probably been 40 or 50 cases that we can document where a Bigfoot's been shot. And in many, many cases where one's been shot, a second one has been seen. And there's probably a dozen or more cases where there have been 4 or more Bigfoots seen at one location. There's a website called Bigfoot Encounters where there's a report in there and 14 Bigfoot were seen at a location. We believe that it's a rare occurrence that a Bigfoot travels alone. They probably are in at least multiples of 2 and maybe more. And they hide and they stay low and they conceal themselves very well. And it's like one person out at the point and everyone's behind. And if one gets shot, we think others come up, grab it, and take it home. And they leave with it. Now, early on when I was in Hoopa, elders told me, they took me out on the reservation, and they showed us where on the reservation these things lived, in the most inhospitable areas you can imagine, way ups in rocks, crevices, places researchers won't go, don't want to go. And recently we've had a series of sightings way up on granite ledges where climbers were climbing and happened to see one. So all of a sudden this is starting to make sense to us that obviously they want to conceal themselves, they want to stay away from us, and they want their privacy. So why not make it in a location where we will never go? That's number one. Number two is every Native American tribe we have interviewed says that they bury their own. And if they watch what Native Americans do, if they mimic their behavior, if they are a tribe in and of themselves, if they do take their own people when they're injured and they leave with them, that all starts to make sense.
It certainly does. David Paulides is my guest. We'll be joined in a couple of minutes after the break by Dr. Melba Ketchum to talk about the search for DNA evidence in confirming the existence of Sasquatch, otherwise known as Bigfoot. Stay with us here on Coast to Coast AM. Thanks for being with us, everyone. We're talking with David Paulides, one of the world's foremost experts on the Bigfoot mystery and author of a book, Tribal Bigfoot, one of the very best books on this topic I have ever read. And the discussion is focused on evidence. What would it take to convince regular folks that this is real, that the Bigfoot mystery has been solved? And certainly DNA evidence would be something that would be very persuasive in that debate. And when we come back, we're going to be joined by Dr. Melba Ketchum, a scientist, specializes in DNA research and DNA analysis, and she'll tell us where things stand on the Bigfoot mystery. Stay with us on Coast to Coast. David Paulides is my guest, talking about Tribal Bigfoot, his excellent book on this topic. We're joined now by Dr. Melba Ketchum. She has a doctorate in veterinary medicine, founded a company called DNA Diagnostics, which does DNA testing on human and animal forensics, and also specializes in species identification, which certainly fits the bill, what we're talking about tonight. Dr. Ketchum, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
I have to wonder, are you crazy to get involved in something like this? This can't possibly help your reputation.
Oh, probably.
Have you caught any grief, even the limited amount of work that you've done on it?
I was pretty well established before this came along, so at this point it doesn't matter what other people think.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that. Are you hooked on the story, on the mystery?
Somewhat. I was a total skeptic, I would say. A little more than a year ago, I was a total skeptic. And that has since changed.
What changed it?
Some unusual findings on some of the research we've done.
Well, tell me about it.
Well, last year, Dave's group sent in some samples. And frankly, we started getting these samples back in 1995. And we've fiddled with them all these years. And they always come out either a raccoon or a horse or something common. And I've never had any of them to turn out like I thought they might. So I decided, okay, apes run on human primers or human tests. And if these things are apes, they'll show up. And if they're human, they'll show up. So I started just screening these things for convenience sake. And one of Dave's samples showed up with a very strange peak in a location that it shouldn't have been. And it was a visual male, and it was a sex marker. And it showed up as a female with a peak where it was not supposed to be located. And I reran the thing, and it still showed an unusual band there or peak there. And so I decided that, this is not normal. And, of course, one sample is not going to help. And regrettably, I used up the DNA because, as Dave referred to earlier, these samples are the hair samples are hard to get a good yield of DNA from. And at that time, I didn't believe in it, so I just screened right through it. And this kind of changed my mind, and I was a little more curious about it at that point.
When you talk about it peaking, you mean peaking like on a chart? Or
yeah,
what do you mean?
The electropherograms, which is a graphic representation of the DNA fragment.
David, where did you get this particular sample?
This one came out of Northern California, right on the Oregon border.
And how did you get it? I mean, you just found that somebody found it on a fence, and why would you associate it with a Bigfoot?
Well, the first one we had came out of a story in Hoopa where a woman lived on the perimeter of the reservation, and in the middle of the night, she had her perimeter motion light go on. She looked out the window and she saw something rummaging through her garbage pile on the side yard. and she just saw a couple of arms hanging over the side, and she thought it was some kind of prowler, and her brother-in-law was a police officer on duty, so she called and she said there was a prowler out there. So they responded to police officers. He went out, or they said, well, try to get a better description. So she walked over to the door and looked out the side. So it was a Bigfoot leaning over the top of this metal shed, rummaging through her bags of garbage. And she heard the sirens coming, lights were coming, and just as these guys were pulling into the yard, the Bigfoot went into the Douglas fir trees, and one of the sergeants has since died, but the other one that was still alive, the guy told me it was one of the most scary things he ever had encountered, because as he got out of the car, he could still feel the earth moving from this thing walking maybe 100 feet away in the woods.
David had told me, Dr. Ketchum, David had told me that you have been partially influenced in your willingness to proceed with this kind of research by comments made by some of your colleagues. And David, I know in Tribal Bigfoot, you mentioned this guy, Dr. Rogers, who was, I guess, out with the Monster Quest team, and he came to the opinion that a hair sample that he had was, quote, like no other hair he has seen, doesn't match mammal's hair in North America, certainly isn't a bear, and it looks kind of human. Is that part of the opinion that Dr. Ketchum helped change your mind?
Well, I've got a team assembled of really high-quality scientists, and the way we've set this thing up, we do have all hair samples screened by a forensic supervisor who does hair on a regular basis. And yes, some of the samples that we receive are not real, and he knows it right away. But those that he cannot identify, they go into the actual program. And yes, there are hairs that can't be identified.
So how do you reconcile that? Meaning they can't identify them, it's something we just don't know what it is, or you just don't have enough of a sample, or a combination of the two, or what?
Well, they have certain human characteristics about them, and then they turn around and they also have animal characteristics. It's a strange, and in light of trying to be without an opinion, we call them just unknowns. And at that point, then they go into the DNA. Where, we actually can do species ID.
How many of those do you have?
Oh, quite a number. I actually haven't counted them recently, but there's quite a few.
And what other explanations would there be? What's the range of explanations that you think would be possible or on your list?
Well, maybe just aberrant hair that's not really growing normally from another animal or something, but there's really not a lot of explanation to cover it, because hair analysts are usually pretty doggone good at least narrowing down the different species.
So David was telling us that you need a hair with a follicle, right? Do you have one of those?
Yes, we have a few of those. More without than with, though, regrettably. We actually like to see a little tissue tags hanging on the end of the root. Those are the ones that are just really premium as far as for giving us the DNA we need at this point.
Let's do a hypothetical here. Let's say you get a clump of hair. It's got some follicles on it. You run the test and DNA. Is there such a thing as a proof positive that this is some other kind of primate species?
Well, we can't go there verbally at this time. Let's just say that we've got some fairly compelling evidence so far, but we're going to nail the coffin shut before we publish, because we want to make sure that skeptics can't question anything we've done. We're doing these like forensic cases.
Okay. Well, I understand that you don't want to let the cat out of the bag about anything you have right now. I'm just wondering, in a hypothetical, a general sense, is there a way that you can prove it beyond any doubt?
I feel so, yes.
And would it be that if you can't identify what the species is, I wonder, how do you prove that it is like a Bigfoot then? Well,
you're going to compare it to other species and see what it's similar to.
Right.
And, just hypothetically, if it shows more in its DNA sequence, it shows more ape bases, then you could say, well, it's a type of ape. If it shows something aligning more with human, then you would say it's a new brand of human. And if it's, somewhere in between, you might consider it a cross. Or if it's got ancient bases, you could call it a Neanderthal or a Neanderthal cross.
Wow, that's fascinating. And can you tell me what the protocol would be? I deal a lot with the UFO topic, and I always wonder what would happen if they had confirmed evidence of something like that. What was the protocol that you would follow if you nailed it down?
Well, the first thing we do, like I say, is we validate everything we're doing first. We make sure it's working. And then we come in with our unknown samples, and we take pictures of them, measure them, do everything to catalog them, just like you would a forensic case, make sure chain of custody is as intact as you can get it. And then you start with your testing. As soon as we get them back, if it's hair, we get it back from the hair analyst, then we move forward with usually mitochondrial testing, which is of course, maternally inherited. It comes from your mother. And that gives you species ID information. It gives you, it just gives you a lot of information, quite frankly. Origins of the maternal lineage. And then once that's completed, then you would go forward into nuclear testing.
Well, let's say, though, you follow all those steps, you've got it down, you're convinced you've got the real deal there. How do you announce it to the world, or do you?
Oh, yeah, we'll announce it.
Would you hold a news conference, write a paper?
Yeah. Well, both. There'll be a peer-reviewed paper produced because that's the only way to do it right. And, furthermore, we're having our work is being back-checked from independent sources. And
well, it
kind
sounds
of like
to
a
me
blind study.
Yeah, it sounds to me like this. We're not talking hypothetical here. That you're down the road without spilling too many beans.
We're down the road. We are down the road with it.
Oh, wow, that's exciting. Now, David, you mentioned something about a bone sample. Tell me about that, where you got it, and what you think you have.
Well, honestly, we weren't quite sure what we have. I'm not an expert at that, and it was given to us, and it was found in a creek bed up in Oregon, and I let some people look at it that were familiar with human skeletons. They said it was too big for that, and I'm not too familiar with animals, and Dr. Ketchum is, so I forwarded it up to her, and I think it's right now under review, and it has some interest.
Dr. Ketchum, can you add anything to that?
The bone's huge.
Is it? Yeah.
I mean, it's just only a couple of things it could be, and that's without going into any analysis on it.
Is bone better than hair?
Not necessarily. Skeletal remains usually are degraded, especially those that may have come from a creek bed, and therefore, you have to work really hard to get any DNA out of them. And usually when you get it, it's only the mitochondrial DNA, and that is not enough to do a full spectrum test. So it'll give us information, yes. I think we'll be able to, due to the number of samples we have, we'll be able to place it where it needs to be placed. As far as getting a yes or no definitive answer on it, I'm not sure at this point. It'll just depend on how degraded the DNA is when we get into it.
Help me paint a picture for me about how this might be received. Let's say you write this paper. It's reviewed by your colleagues. You got double-blind studies and tests and all this, and you've really nailed it down. Can you get something like that published in a journal, a scientific journal?
Oh, I think so. I think as long as you cross your T's and dot your I's and do things in a proper scientific fashion, that it'll go just like the Neanderthal paper did.
Would you call it Bigfoot? What would you call it? would you even put a name to it? Because that'd be kind of scary, wouldn't it?
We've got some names we've kind of knocked around, but there's not. It'll take it. Cause one thing I want to brag about is that all these people that have submitted samples, they're wonderful people, and they're coming together for the first time, I think, ever, because there's a lot of rivalry in the Bigfoot organizations, and I've found that, the people that I'm working for at this point, that they're all just really wanting to get to the bottom of it, and they're wanting to work together. And I'm sure some of this will be consensus stuff when we get down to the very end.
Well, I hope you're right about the you'll have no trouble getting it published. I just have had a lot of feedback from scientists studying exotic sorts of topics who dot the I's and cross the T's and do what they're supposed to do, and they run into considerable resistance when it's something controversial like this. I guess part of it would be labeling and how you label it. If you announce the discovery of some previously unknown primate and don't mention the size of its feet, you might get away with it.
Well, George, think about this. This approach has never been utilized before. So we have a sample coming out of Hoopa. We send a trained forensic artist out, interviews the witness. She shows where the hair was. The hair wasn't there the night before. She sees the biped lean over. The hair is pulled off the biped as it pulls the garbage bag over. The artist sits down, draws what she observed. The hair is recovered. The hair is sent to the lab. Now we have this trail with this drawing of what left it. Now we have a trained PhD going after the DNA at a scientific, sterile level. Really, this approach has never been used before.
David, you're not maybe under the same scientific or professional constraints that Dr. Ketchum is. Can you give me some hints about how far down the road this will be, and will you be part of whatever this announcement is?
Well, I hope so. I mean, we've been at this longer than I think almost anyone, and we'll continue to try to take samples to Dr. Ketchum when we think that they're valuable and give her our support. And I can guarantee, as I've told the people that have written to us in the past, that, and I've learned this from Dr. Ketchum, that you can't push science. What we thought might have been a 3 or 4 month cycle to get to the end has really, really taken a lot longer. And it's a testament to her and the people that we're working with that they're trying to do this the right way, because when the people come back and they try to second guess us, that they'll be able to stand behind the results.
What she mentioned about rivalries in the field, you've had to run into that yourself?
You know, of course you do. And there's been some great researchers in the past, and there have been some people that call themselves researchers, but they aren't really doing research. And when we got into this, we had most of us came from business before, technology, law enforcement, whatever. We wrote a business plan about how we were going to approach this, and we've stuck to that plan. And when Dr. Ketchum comes out with the results, we're done. And the reality behind this is that we're not going to make this a lifelong pursuit like some other people have. We're in this to get results, and then we're going to move on to our next lifelong ambition, whatever that may be. But people can Monday night quarterback us. They can call us names. They can say, oh, we don't have any friends, and you're not working with anybody. That's fine. And the reality is this is the first time we've come forward and ever introduced the world to really what we're doing at that DNA level.
Dr. Ketchum, what about the expense? I mean, this DNA testing, that's pretty expensive stuff from what I understand. How are you covering that, or are you just eating it?
Well, I've eaten my time on it, but I've made everybody fork out at least something to go toward the consumables. And it hasn't been cheap, and, you know, we still, in fact, we have a nonprofit for this very purpose. For that reason, when we get donations, you know, that way they can write them off on their taxes. But, you know, we're running on donations on this, quite frankly.
Well, tell me more about that, because this is the first I've heard of it. If there's somebody in the audience who wants to have more information on that, where do they go?
They can contact Dave. Dave is you know, rather than overload us here at the lab, he's kind enough to, you know, people that have maybe samples they might want to submit, or people that are inquiring about making a donation to the research project, they can contact Dave. And I'm sure you can provide them with his contact information there.
And do you get much interest in that, David?
Absolutely. There's a lot of people out there that are very well educated that have been very reticent to be involved in this field for a variety of reasons. But to see somebody come forward and a group come forward with a methodical approach, a scientific approach, a lot of people are starting to come out of the woodwork now and are starting to participate where they didn't want to before. And there haven't been many scientific professionals that have stuck their nose into this for a variety of reasons. But now we're starting to see some involvement, and that is refreshing.
That's amazing. I know the only other name that comes to mind for me is Dr. Jeff Meldrum, the guy from Idaho State, who's been interviewed on a couple of programs, who's had courage in coming forward and saying he's interested in this research. In your book, in Tribal Bigfoot, you tell a story at the end about where he's up in the woods, I guess, with some TV show, Monster Quest or something, and they had some sort of an encounter out there?
Yeah, Snellgrove Lake up in Canada. That's actually a great episode because you could see on their faces they were concerned. They were in the middle of nowhere. They flew into this lake on a floatplane, and they started to have some rocks thrown at them on a tin roof. And the gentlemen there, including Dr. Meldrum, they look concerned.
I think the way you describe it is that they all got in the building and hid out and locked the doors and got the heck out of there. All right, well, we'll continue our conversation with Dave Paulides and Dr. Melba Ketchum. We're going to the phones for your questions right after these breaks and these messages on Coast to Coast AM. We're talking with David Paulides and Dr. Melba Ketchum, and I don't know if you're putting all this together, but it sure sounds like from our conversation that we're on the verge of some sort of a pretty big announcement about Bigfoot. Scientific evidence, published paper. I mean, I know there's a lot of steps still to be taken, but it sure sounds like something is coming, and you've heard about it first right here. When we come back, we'll go to the phones with your questions for my guests on Coast to Coast AM. We're in the home stretch with our guests talking about Bigfoot, going to the phones west of the Rockies. Rich in Washington, up there in Bigfoot territory, and I think, Rich, you may know the guests?
Yeah, I do.
Hi, Rich.
You still there, Rich?
Yeah, I'm here.
What's on your mind?
I'm working with Dr. Ketchum, and I'm pretty good friends with Dave. I talk to him quite a bit. We have a camera trap project we're doing on the Olympic Peninsula called the Olympic Project, and I've sent a couple of samples to Dr. Ketchum in relation to some other evidence that we've collected, and I know I talked to Dave, and he said that I could go ahead and call in. I don't really have a question, but I don't know if they want to talk about it or if they have anything to add or anything like that.
Well, George,
I have. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, Rich is doing a fantastic job up there. He's in prime Bigfoot area, and they have some very good cameras that they've set up along ridge lines and in prime area. And their team has gotten some very interesting results and some very interesting photos out of there. Nothing that you would say, oh, yeah, that's a Bigfoot for sure. But he's just gotten some great pictures, some great results that he's set on. Dr. Ketchum, a very credible guy and working with some credible people.
I remember in your book, David, you call in Tribal Bigfoot, you refer to these creatures as ridge walkers. Is that Rich? Is that why you're putting your cameras up on the ridges, because that's where they roam?
We had some interesting. I had a sighting some years ago, and I've kind of been interested in the topic. And then I got tied up with a guy named Derek Randall, who lives nearby me. And we got into it together. Well, he'd been doing it for a long, long time, but, I got in contact with him, and we got going on this project. And I found tracks on top of a ridge about 3 or 4 years ago, actually less than that, a couple of years ago. And we started thinking about it and trying to funnel these things down and try to figure something out with them about migration or what kind of terrain that they use to travel to avoid people or whatever they're doing. And we decided on these ridge lines because they're the tops of they're the easiest place to travel, basically in the woods in the steep terrain like in the Olympic Mountains here. It's wide open and it's obvious it's an animal highway on top of there, and we thought, well, it makes perfect sense that these things would use these to travel from one place to another because it's the fastest way to get somewhere. And they can do it without detection because people don't normally walk on top of these ridges. It's really hard to get to them. They're off-trail, off-road, and they're relatively safe. And we ended up finding some evidence to support what we thought with tracks, and we've got about 40 cameras. We've been doing this for about a year and a half, and yeah, like Dave said, we have some really interesting results. We've got some photographs. I mean, we're pretty sure about what we have. I mean, it's up to the individuals that want to look at them to decide for themselves. But we took some swabs off one of our cameras where we got some interesting photos, and they're working with that stuff now. And we've collected hair, found tracks, pretty much all kinds of stuff. We think that we're going to have good results over the term of the project, and we plan on it being quite long-term.
Well, Rich, that sounds really promising. I hope when you get further down the line and you got something definitive to say, you'll keep Coast to Coast in mind, come back on the show and tell us about it.
Yeah, we have a website that has a lot of our stuff up there.
Well, what is it? Go ahead and say.
It's www.olympicproject.com.
All right, we'll take a look. Rich, thanks for calling in. We're going to east of the Rockies. Terry in South Carolina. Hi, Terry.
Hi, George. I just wondered if you all had ever heard of Nobby up in Kaiser, North Carolina. It's,
David?
No, I've never heard that term, but I've heard a few others for that part of the country.
Well, they call it Nobby up it's in Cleveland County. We just had a sighting this last month, about a month ago. A gentleman was playing with one of his homemade animal calls. He's a hunter, and he claims he was out using this call, and basically Bigfoot just came up out of the woods to him. And he was pretty intent that it had beautiful hair, beautiful long hair. But it made it on local news. I didn't know if y'all had heard about it. It was on Channel 3 and 36 and most of the major local stations around here. But it happened up in Cleveland County. Even called in on the Cleveland County 911 if y'all want to check into that or anything.
So Nobby is like a regional nickname?
Yeah, it's you've got basically we're in the foothills section out near where I live. We're not exactly up in the mountains, but anyway, it's the foothills. You know what I mean? And in the foothills, you've got higher peaks, and we usually just term those as knobs. They're not really tall enough to be a mountain, but not big enough. They're a little bigger than a hill, so we'll call them a knob. It's just a regional terminology.
Terry, we appreciate the call. David, anything to add to that? You want to talk to this guy further?
Other than he's in prime Bigfoot country, and any type of sighting coming out of there has some validity to it just because there's so many out there.
Okay, we appreciate the call. We're going to go to our wild card line, Christian in Los Angeles. Hi, Christian. Good morning.
Hello. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Well, my name's Christian. I've called in before, and I have the thing is, first thing I want to add is that I've had an interest in Bigfoot or Sasquatch for years, and I've kept up with it very well, been very current. And in the beginning, I always thought that the Bigfoot sightings were in, like, the Pacific Northwest. And I was really surprised over time that really Sasquatch sightings have been sighted all the way from the Pacific coast of the United States across the country to Texas, Louisiana, to Florida. So they've migrated, I guess, over the millennia all over the country, and they're able to remain hidden. The second question I had were for your guest this evening, and that is that I have never heard or read anything of a Sasquatch deliberetely going out of their way and harming people. And that's why when I was watching the History Channel Monster Quest episode, and as you said earlier, there was the expedition up in Canada in Snellgrove Lake at that fishing cabin, which was isolated out in the middle of nowhere. And Jeff Meldrum and several other researchers said that they literally, and other people that they've, who've been up there on fishing expeditions, felt that in the summer months, which is, I guess, the prime active time, that they literally felt that the Sasquatch in the region didn't want anybody there. And what do you think about this pattern of aggressive behavior in that one particular region? And I just wanted to say thank you for taking your time.
Okay, Christian, thank you.
I don't think it's one particular area. That pattern of showing aggression, whether it's through a scream, a yell, or whether it's through rock throwing, that's pretty consistent across the entire U.S. and Canada. And you might be treading on their privacy or their hunting area, and they want you out of there, and they're going to try to intimidate you to get you out. And they usually throw small rocks, stones. Very rarely does it even ever hit anybody, but it's more of an intimidation than anything else.
And as for the hurting anyone, I guess we covered that sort of earlier in the interview. There are at least some anecdotal cases mentioned by Native Americans that there have been people harmed.
Certainly.
Okay. Wildcard line, Andrew, also in L.A. Hi, Andrew. Good morning.
Hi, George. I love your deep and probing questions. You're an excellent interviewer. And Doctor and David, two quick questions. Number one, let's see. Grand Canyon area several years ago, doctor going on a hiking expedition there with his family, and he encountered a Bigfoot. Allegedly, he had his recorder on. And was there any follow-up information as to his credibility and any additional information on that? And secondly, approximately within 15 years, I wish I could give you a better timeline, I saw on late-night TV after midnight in Los Angeles a film footage on the news after midnight in which some anonymous donor gave the news department a clip of some night vision footage of a Bigfoot, and it was very, very clear. He must have had some excellent quality equipment. The footage showed a creature big, very big, very primitive looking, and very alert and aware, and even in the darkness was looking in all directions, like super awareness of what was around him. And have you ever run across or heard about that film footage? And I appreciate your answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
There actually has been some excellent night vision and FLIR footage that's been taken of Bigfoot. And it's just like the caller explained. If you can imagine an Army soldier on speed, methamphetamine, and he's moving his head right to left, up and down, staying low to the ground, on cover, behind a tree, always looking. That's exactly the way it is. They stay low to the ground. They stay behind cover. They look every once in a while. They're very nervous. It's exactly the way it is.
Hey, Dr. Ketchum, thanks, Andrew, for that call. Dr. Ketchum, I had a question for you. Are you reluctant to sort of delve into the Bigfoot library to read all the books? Are you familiar with other kinds of evidence that maybe is not in your area of specialty, like the dermal ridges, for example, that was mentioned by David earlier? Or do you have to keep yourself away from that stuff so you don't sort of get too biased about the whole thing?
Oh, no, I read it. I have to admit I read it. I don't like it when I don't know what somebody's talking about, so I've educated myself. I don't think I have to worry about being biased because the DNA is either going to, do it or not do it. It's just that simple. And the DNA doesn't lie. So it doesn't matter whether I'm biased or not because I can't affect the outcome of the results. And also, I have a really true skeptic PhD on my team that just absolutely believes they don't exist, and he keeps everybody kind of on the straight and narrow. And then I have two other PhDs that they waffle a little bit, but mostly I think they're leaning towards belief. It's an interesting group I have. They're all very well known and very credible individuals. So it's going to be a really nice thing when we get it all put together.
Well, it's a very cool thing to have a team like that put together. I mean, you're supposed to be skeptical. You're scientists, but skeptical doesn't mean I refuse to believe. It's that if I believe something to be true, it has to be based on proof, right?
That's right, and that's what I'm saying. The proof is in the DNA, not in anything I believe or, any of my personal feelings toward anything.
Well, I can't wait to hear what this is about. Wildcard line, Dan in Maryland. Good morning, Dan. Dan's not there. How about our first-time caller? Is Justin up there in Reno?
Yep, that's me.
Hey, Justin, how you doing? What's on your mind?
Well, I have a quick question. The yelling of the Sasquatch, a guitar has a tempo. You can tell by its, the vocals. Like, there's got to be some type of way that you can identify the Sasquatch with the vocals and then set with, like, a tempo. is there any type of instrument out there that would actually identify the Sasquatch to any other type of animals? And then if you can identify that Sasquatch's vocal cords, I should say, there's got to be some type of way to visually see this type of creature that's doing this sound. Everything has a different type of a vibe, I should say, like a bass, this stand up, it's big and it has a very deep noise. With a violin, it's very small and it has a very pitched noise. I was just kind of wondering, is there something else that we can probably attain from the vocal cords or the noises from Sasquatch itself, I should say? And I was hoping that George and David had a great question or an answer for this, because I'm from the West Coast, and I actually came from the East Coast, and I actually heard this sound twice from two different areas. And I play the guitar, and I like to associate everything with music. So I'm kind of wondering, is there a way to actually get the tempo of the vocal?
Well, let's find out. Justin, that's a good point. David, have you ever done any vocal analysis of any recordings?
Others have. And, in fact, they took it to some wildlife labs that have the spectrum of every animal's range in their bark, scream, whatever. And the results came back that it was outside the spectrum of anything that they'd had on file, and they couldn't define it. So the caller was on the right track. It's one of those things where it's not on file. They proved it couldn't have been a man-made sound. That was another thing that came back. So it was made by something that was living, but they didn't have it filed.
Dr. Ketchum, I noticed in your resume it said you specialize in species identification. Would that be a kind of a piece of evidence that you would consider?
Well, we do DNA, not vocal analysis, but there's been some really good work on that out there by other people. And, I'm sure you go on the net, you can find it. There's even an alphabet out there now.
All right, we're going to try to get one more call in east of the Rockies. Jody in North Dakota. You got to be quick on this one, Jody.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I will certainly try.
Okay.
One of the questions I wanted to ask your guest, David, was in exploring the Bigfoots being around the reservation areas where the native tribes are, has he explored the fact that maybe there's some connection between the native people and the creatures?
Absolutely. And if you go back to the belief that they are another tribe in and of themselves, and they've lived around other Native American tribes for hundreds, if not thousands of years, then there's a certain comfort and respect level. And we think that the closer they stay to those tribal areas, the less that they're molested and bothered and annoyed. And there's a somewhat give and let give relationship by all these tribes towards the Bigfoot. This time, there isn't a lot of kidnapping. There isn't a lot of people being taken and stolen from the reservations. And so it appears as though it's more of a harmonic relationship right now. But those are our thoughts, and that's one of the reasons that we pursued the reservation research.
Thanks, Jody, for the call. We've got about a minute left here. Can you give me sort of a synopsis? What's coming next? What kind of a time frame? When we might hear something from the two of you? Dr. Ketchum, I'll start with you.
Well, it just depends on how good the research continues. It could be as early as a month or so, or it could be a little longer.
You will come back and talk to me about it, won't you?
Oh, sure.
Are you enthusiastic and are you optimistic?
I'm very optimistic and very enthusiastic at this point.
Well, this could be gigantic. I mean, could be worldwide news.
Well, we'll find out, won't we?
David, parting thoughts from you?
I would tell your listeners that for the people that are involved at some level, that maybe have some strange type of visitors in the middle of the night and they have a hair sample laying around, send it in to us. It's under our contact information on our website. we'll gladly let you participate. We'll keep you updated. We'll put the specimen under your name, and we'll send it on to Dr. Ketchum.
And you would rather have tissue or samples or something with more tissue to it if possible.
All right, Dr. Melba Ketchum, thanks very much. David Paulides, always good to have you on the program. Also, my thanks to our earlier guest, Dr. Robert Lanza. Thank you all for sticking with us, and I'll be back next month. Good night, everyone.